This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people's hands have had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting a position on me. We'll never let the true facts become born to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, yeah? Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 108. I am your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we're finally back with our OG series. The first series we ever did. Maybe some people thought it was done, but
no,
it's really
you probably could. For a while.
It probably won't be done for a while. But of course, we are talking about our CONTRA series.
We'll probably at least never declare it done.
Never. Why would we? Why would we?
Yeah, you never know. Yeah, it's really still ongoing. Like, current events could.
It is.
Be the subject of an installment of this.
Yeah, there's some people from this generation, or maybe they're the second generation, that are still kind of dominating international business and politics to this day. And like the ripple effect from all of the CONTRA shit. I think we've seen that in like every chapter, that its history still haunts us. This shadowy octopus network of financiers, drug traffickers, intelligence operatives, politicos, making the world safe for what they call democracy. But I think we could find a lot of other words for it now, looking back in 2022. So I guess we decided to jump back in or reignite this series with an exploration into something that has come up in a few of the CONTRA episodes previously. And that is the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, which definitely came up a lot, I know, in CONTRA 4, Interlock.
Yeah, it was definitely one of the big interlocks.
Yeah, it was one of the kind of most significant works by the artist Mark Lombardi were his BCCI drawings. Wasn't one of which was mysteriously damaged in like a flood in his apartment, right?
I don't recall, but I vaguely remember what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he wasn't working on recreating it when he mysteriously died right before 9/11.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. But of course, the other things too. I think even going back to CONTRA 1 and CONTRA 2, we're going to see a lot of like the same colorful characters pop up in this narrative, right?
Yeah, I think this is like one of the most like interesting things to me, because I didn't really appreciate like the nature and the background of BCCI. I was like really hooked into this one by like the character of Agha Hasan Abedi, who is the sort of founder of BCCI. It's kind of like there's a fair number of like books or articles written about this. It was a big scandal when this bank folded eventually. There's a lot of sort of mystery and mystique around the figure of Abedi, and I think he's a complex individual that it's interesting to explore, and the sort of the aspect of BCCI sort of coming out of Pakistan and being like the first like big third world like financial institution that could compete with the sort of Western equivalents. It's interesting, and it's
really
an interesting
is.
wrinkle in all of this.
I have to confess that I don't think I fully understood. Like, I thought I understood BCCI pretty well, just because it's one of those acronyms that pops up so much in like Iran Contra research. And but it's always interesting when you kind of take something. It seemed like BCCI was so blatantly fraudulent and sus, and it eventually did go down in flames in this huge scandal. And it almost is like, well, you could take for granted that everything they said about BCCI is pretty much, it was super corrupt. And I remember, again, I have to confess, like the idea that this like seemingly random Pakistani guy, Abedi, seemingly random, was kind of running it, always seemed like, oh, well, he was probably just some minor player to like put a face on it. But it was actually all these machinations. And, maybe there's an aspect of truth to that, but there's really much more to the story if you just look at it if you focus on the character of Abedi and the origins of BCCI itself in the kind of South Asian region in like the 1970s, leading up into its most infamous decade in the 80s. This was like an Islamic bank. Like, this was the beginning in a lot of ways of the whole discourse around like Sharia compliant banking and things like that, that you still hear about today. Like, this was an attempt to kind of like rise out of the immiseration that the broader sort of Islamic world had felt itself to be in, as a result of like the dominance of, there was no native alternative or no Islamic alternative to the Western banking institutions or anything like that. And I think it's interesting to actually go kind of into the history at some point, like of how like the financial institutions and of Islam, like under colonialism, like had been destroyed, and the immense upheaval that was created, and how this was something that seemed to many people to be like a beacon of hope in certain ways. And I think that even though like there were aspects of corruption within BCCI that can be, I think, pinned on its actual management and like its own structure, I do find it persuasive in certain ways that like this, like because of the hope that this represented to the third world, and because of the or even the opportunity that it represented to the third world in some ways, I think that it was perceived as a threat in many ways, and even like a sort of like it needed to be crushed for symbolic reasons as well. And I think that's why, in some respects, even though like pretty much every single bank ever, like there was corruption in BCCI, it was targeted, and the corruption was inflamed by people whose desire was not just to exploit the bank, for their own shady dealings, but for the ultimate result to be, once the bank ceased to be useful for those ends, to destroy it. In a very flashy, symbolic way. As a patsy, maybe. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like that's a really interesting angle to it that I feel like does sometimes get lost, is that it was like, it wasn't just a cutout for nefarious like international interests and stuff. It did have its like own identity. And I feel like nobody believed in that more than Abedi himself, like in the almost messianic mission that he had to build this like third world banking alternative, and kind of break the old boys club of these like City of London and like American and Western European banks. But it also establishes, and I think we'll get into this like hypothesis or this like alternative framework for looking at it. It establishes kind of like a pattern of behavior that is very interesting and relevant to the overall sprawling like Contra network, whereby international individuals enter into certain relationships with like Americans and their allies, particularly ones focused on like intelligence kind of political intelligence operatives, and then are set up to be a kind of patsy and are sort of, I guess you could say, controlled demoed when the time is right. Would that be a fair way of characterizing it?
I think one could say that they were in some ways controlled demos because, I mean, we like our main sources for like reading for this episode were we looked at like 3 books really. Like False Prophets was the one that you mostly read. That's by Truel, right? Am I right?
I think so.
Yeah, and I read. I think we both have read this one very idiosyncratic book, which I appreciated in many ways, called From BCCI to ISI, The Saga of Entrapment Continues by a man named Abdullah John. The cover of this book is one of the best covers of any book that we've ever read for the podcast. Like on par with that, I think it was the Goblin universe that had like the Loch Ness Monster flying through like a grid like in like an 80s like Tron type world. Like
or like
the cover
Bigfoot, the interdimensional hypothesis. Where, like,
that is all.
Sasquatch is walking out of a portal.
Walking out of a portal in a tree. This one has like a kind of a crude Photoshop of like a spider spinning like a web, but it has the head of like a bald eagle with like an American flag superimposed over it. I mean,
it's amazing. It's a spider world.
Yeah, it's great.
It's truly a spider world.
Yeah, and that's
definitely going to be the album art for this episode.
Yeah, and then I read another book that I guess you didn't get as much of a chance to read, which was Outlaw Bank by Jonathan Beatty and his co-writer Gwyn, Gwyn, I forget who exactly. I have to borrow again because my loan expired on archive.org. That's why I'm not able to flip pages in this book. Yeah, it's so great. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert
Thank
Cargill.
you. Yeah, thank you, Chuck Wendig for
Chuck
complaining.
Wendig, that's right.
Yeah, right. Jonathan Beatty and S.C. Gwyn. So I don't know what the actual name is there. But yeah, so reading this book, Outlaw Bank, like Outlaw Bank is kind of like written in a almost like a thriller, like very narrative format. There's like a lot of dialogue. Actually, the authors are kind of referred to in the third person as kind of like the heroes throughout. So it's a bit weird. But this is like a very influential book about BCCI anyway. And like their description of Abedi and like his background is pretty interesting. Like, let me see if like archive.org is going to like comply with me in this in any way.
Well, I just want to mention, I think one of the things that spurred us onto this, and I'm sure we'll touch on it with Abedi, is I think somebody on Twitter edited us like in the last couple weeks.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if it was a magazine or like a newspaper article about Abedi where he allegedly described BCCI as like he regarded it as like a living entity or something.
Yeah, like I think it's on his Wikipedia. I think it was just a screen cap of Wikipedia that someone added us with, that he viewed it as like a God-given entity or something, which like, does make like, does seem consistent with, his general outlook. Like just to like read some stuff from Outlaw Bank, because this is like, the most kind of lurid description of Abedi that you can get. And it's like full of like, if you thought like that there was like kind of like fuzzy, like, pseudo, like, I mean, this is just like straight up, like this book is like kind of Orientalist, like really, like there's a lot of like weird, like, or just straight up inaccurate like stuff about, like, if people ever wanted to understand why like I hate the term like mysticism, like you can find out from like reading some of the stuff written about Agha Hasan Abedi. So this is like just from the introduction of their book. It says, Abedi himself was ascetic. He was both a visionary and a romantic. He was Muslim, but no ordinary one. Though born into the Shiite sect of Islam, he later drifted into the religion of the secretive Sufi sect, which claimed a direct and personal relationship with God based on love. Like, oh, how bizarre. Like a direct relationship with God based on love. Never heard of anything like that before.
Strange.
It gets worse. By contrast, mainstream Islam was built around fear and submission. The business style he created, the management theory of the bank, was unlike any ever seen before in a large company. He incorporated his Islamic mysticism into the palpable driving force of the bank. Advancement was based on spiritual progress, and Abedi took Islam's emphasis on the good of the family and society ahead of individualism and transmuted it to an intensely democratic theory of management. All would devolve into corruption, and Abedi's mysticism would eventually sound like a hodgepodge of California New Age gobbledygook and Dale Carnegie. Yet it was a powerful original vision, and it constituted the early strength of the bank. goes on to say he was perhaps the most brilliant pure businessman the developing world has ever produced, which is like kind of like a backhanded insult. First saying that he was like a complete fraud, a weirdo who built a complete like bank that had nothing to it. But I find that passage interesting because like all the blame eventually like devolves to like Islam somehow. Like that's what went wrong. Like it's because of Islam is like based on like fear and submission, or like there is some kind of secretive, the quote unquote secretive Sufi sect, which is not like a thing.
These are not the types of things that a responsible international banker believes in, right?
Exactly. Well, also like, I mean, it's just like poor scholarship in general. Obviously, it's not like a book about Islam, so you don't necessarily expect them to like know these things, but like Sufism isn't really a sect, as we talked about before. Sufism is like a part of Islam. Both Shia and Sunni Islam have like Sufism as a dimension of their practice. But yeah, so
a lot of this because False Prophets also kind of gets into a little bit, probably not as Orientalist and stuff. It's a little bit more fair, but they definitely do portray Abedi as like this guru CEO kind of got really a little bit ahead of his time, because what it really, like what you just read reminds me of, like, it's funny how there's like 3 different Silicon Valley like miniseries out right now that are all about like a manipulative, lying, like guru cult tech CEO that, like frauds their way to the top and then has this like huge downfall.
And one of them is about Theranos, right?
Yeah, one of them is about
I was even
going to
say that he is similar in certain ways. Like he could be compared maybe to Sunny Balwani in certain respects, but like kind of in reverse, where Sunny Balwani was a Hindu from Pakistan. For what became Pakistan. Abedi had the opposite situation where he
I forgot that there was
I
forgot he was Pakistani. Getting in there. Interesting. Not to like sus jacket all Pakistanis, but there are going to be a lot of them that pop up in this episode.
Yeah, well, technically speaking, Abedi, like, and his family was in what was India. Yeah. But then they moved to Pakistan, whereas what happened to Balwani was the opposite. Because after partition, a lot of Hindus moved to India, and a lot of Muslims moved to Pakistan.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, you could even look at it as, you could even draw comparisons also of him to Elizabeth Holmes, in that he embraced, like, he was of a kind of background that was not dominant in the field that he was going into. In Elizabeth Holmes' case, even though like her dad was a VP at Enron, whole nother story, she was a woman in tech, right? And there was like, she had to fight, or she perceived that she had to combat a lot of like latent sexism and stuff. And there's a certain similarity with how Abedi felt like, as a Pakistani, as a Muslim from the third world, that he wasn't going to get the same respect that like Anglo-American bankers would get. And he complained about, I mean, that was often, I think not, it wasn't just like a bullshit like defensive strategy. Like I think there was during BCCI's kind of tenure. And maybe this is almost like by design, why so many certain American forces decided to like get in bed with them, is that you could kind of like Muslim coat like whatever was going on, and at the end of the day have this guy that like the old blue bloods would go, oh well, he's a Muslim, or something like that. Yeah,
and then could scapegoat them after the fact for all the shady things that you did. Yep. And like really like was prior to the choice to use BCCI for all of these like sting operations and all of this like drug smuggling, like that was coordinated by like intelligence agencies in the United States. Was BCCI really more corrupt or more fraudulent than most banks? I don't know. Like, is that true? Like, I'm not sure if it really was. Like, it certainly wasn't what it was called.
That got busted out at the end of the 80s, including, I think, one where one of the Bush sons worked. I think it was either Jonathan or Neil Bush worked, I think, Silverado Savings and Loan, which, I think that also ties into it and was going on independently of BCCI. Just like the massive criminality of the banking sector in the fucking 80s was so out of control that it is kind of ridiculous to like just point at BCCI as this one fount of corruption in an otherwise like very respectable field. Like, ain't nothing was respectable in the fucking 1980s. Everybody was laundering coke money. Everyone was like doing weird shit to like send money to the Contras, Afghanistan or like secretly sell weapons to Iraq or Iran. You know, like you really see like the satanic frenzy of the international banking, of like the Western banking system. And of course, BCCI was a part of it, but you know, were they the only part of it? And was it just because these guys were a bunch of Arab? I mean, it goes into the whole trope about that started with the reversal after like the oil crisis in the 70s. Another thing that's kind of relevant to right now, where I think we're sitting at $6 a gallon gas right now where I live. And there's a lot of talk again about like the global oil markets and things like that. And, you know, I think BCCI like really had its come up after the OPEC oil embargo and the oil crisis in the early 70s, right? And then you had this explosion in revenues to these Middle Eastern countries, these Arab Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc. And a lot of that money ended up getting like, you know, basically deposited in BCCI and then made its way around the world. And, you know, it's a very common trope of like, oh, like the Saudi sheiks are going to London and they're dropping like $100,000 every 5 minutes. And, you know, they bring 200 servants with them and all this shit. And it's always kind of treated like, ooh, look at these like Arab Bedouins. Like they're so wacky and they're just coming over here and they're so corrupt. And even
BCCI, which wasn't even a bank started. I mean, they did have a lot of sort of faces that they cultivated who were wealthy Arabs and investors who were wealthy Arabs, but like they were often seen as like a bank that was run by or fronted by these wealthy Arabs. But really, it originated in Pakistan. But yeah, I mean, reading
but
some of
it got the come up from the UAE, right? Because the contact with who was the
Pharaoh.
Oh no, that was the
Clive
Saudi
Pharaoh.
businessman.
Yeah.
Guy Pharaoh. He comes in later. That guy's a major.
Sheikh Zayed, is that who you're talking about?
Sheikh Zayed. Yeah. He was who became the head of Abu Dhabi, where most of the oil in the UAE is, and then basically, I mean, BCCI was established with a lot of upfront money from Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, which is the ruling family. And also the who was the other a very wealthy Pakistani family also bankrolled the beginning of BCCI.
Yeah, I remember reading about them a bit, but I'm not sure. I don't recall who their name was. Yeah, I don't recall off the top of my head.
Yeah, who I guess because Abedi worked for a previous bank in Pakistan, but then it was nationalized under Bhutto, right? The first Bhutto.
Yeah, Zulkifar Bhutto.
Yes, who was really more of like a kind of socialist-leaning kind of politician, I would say.
Kind of.
We can safely say. I mean, he wanted to nationalize. He wanted to nationalize a lot of the industry. I mean, he wasn't like a Marxist, but he was kind of trending in that direction in the 70s, kind of in like a Nasserist sort of direction, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the Bhuttos, like, are super corrupt. Like, Zil Haq, like, he's not better, but the Bhuttos are also, like, incredibly corrupt, like, family. And
I don't doubt that.
Yeah, like, I don't know. They're, yeah.
But they were overthrown in a military coup and then hanged by General Zia, who went on to become Bill Casey's best friend in the 1980s and set up this whole ISI CIA operation to trip up the Soviets in Afghanistan. So, I mean, I don't know. It sounds like they were like maybe a little better, a little preferable than General Zia.
Maybe. A lot of people hate Benazir Bhutto too, like
who was assassinated by heavy air quotes Al-Qaeda in 2007, right? Yeah. I mean, sure, but I almost get, I don't know, I'd have to look in more, but they kind of give me like William Tolbert vibes where like, yes, they're corrupt. Like, yes, they were like making a bunch of money on the side. But again, it goes back to the discourse about corruption in the third world. That it's like, I've read some books about Tolbert where they're like, yeah, he was basically a fucking sociopath. He's a piece of shit. Like, it's good that like people broke into like the presidential mansion and like ate his heart and established like a brutal military dictatorship that was like 100 times more corrupt and 100 times more backed by the U.S. and like drove the country into civil war and poverty. But like, he was a piece of shit. But it's like, well, I don't know. Like, I think there's a little bit of gray area there. Like, I think you could put people like this in a category, and this is very much like the non-aligned movement and a lot of political currents in the third world that were kind of trying to forge like this third path between like full free market capitalism and like Soviet communism or whatever.
My thing is, like, I don't actually know. That's like the thing that I would say that like they were both like, I mean, well, it's interesting because Zia-ul-Haq was actually more like kind of sort of traditional or like wanting to do like more kind of central planning in a way, whereas like the Bhuttos are much more like Western leaning and much more like, you know, they like Benazir Bhutto was like, I want to be the Margaret Thatcher of Pakistan. Like that was her whole pose, and it like that they were like very much like liberal, like neoliberal kind of like secularist, like leaning in that direction, whereas like the sort of you know, for lack of a better word, like the person who would be like caricatured as like the strongman figure, who also was horrible and deeply corrupt, would be Zia-ul-Haq in this comparison. Yeah, and I mean,
it's
they were all like super, like none of them were like pro-communist or like anything like really. Like
the Lost Prophets book kind of characterizes not as communist, but like a socialist-leaning direction as some of Bhutto's policies were, but you also see that, I mean, because actually Bhutto threw Abedi in jail in the early 70s, right? Yeah. So he spent a little time. He was kind of on the shit list for a minute, but then he eventually got out. And I think Lost Prophets mentions that there was a lot of fear. Like one of the reasons he was thrown, it wasn't just because of like banking corruption or anything like that, but there was fear that he was a CIA asset. So, he ended up getting thrown in jail for a while, I think around 71, 72. But then he seemed to kind of get back in the better graces of Bhutto.
He gave him like a bunch of money.
Yeah. So basically both Bhutto and the person who overthrew him, General Zia, both had like business relationships with Abedi and BCCI, you know, at various points. So everybody is kind of like involved in it.
Definitely like there was a sense of Bhutto and Abedi being enemies, and that there would be like kind of, that's the whole issue of like the nationalization of. Well,
I was going to bring that up too, because that was under Bhutto as well, right? They nationalized Abedi's bank.
Zulfikar Bhutto. Yeah.
Yes. So that actually led to him kind of looking for different pastures in the 1970s. Because his bank got nationalized, and he wanted to start a new bank for the third world that would be, you know, international in scope, and that's when he was introduced to Sheikh Zayed of Abu Dhabi, and then he provided a lot of the seed capital, along with a wealthy Pakistani family who he had worked with. I'm trying to. I don't know where the fuck. I know I must have written it down somewhere.
Gorkal? Is that who you're talking about?
Gorkal. Yes, it was the Gorkal family.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. And so with that, he started to open up branches in like a few different countries, and kind of got the UAE on it. And the UAE was like kind of a relatively late comer to like the oil game, right? I mean, like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait had started drilling, and like Iraq had started drilling earlier, and it really, I think, wasn't until like the late 60s, early 70s that they started pumping oil. And then when the oil crisis popped off, interestingly, kind of led by the Shah of Iran, which I always forget that he was like instrumental in sort of leading the oil. You would think is kind of like a U.S. puppet or a U.S. ally, the way he was. That maybe, but I remember reading something years ago that, I don't know, maybe this is wrong, but that Kissinger kind of like encouraged them to do it. But I don't know why he would do that. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I definitely could. That's like another thing. Like that's a great aspect of this, of Outlaw Bank. Like that the Shah is like, again, like everything is kind of seen as being like the result of like Abedi and like BCCI's machinations, and like the Shah is like someone who, like Pahlavi, he's like a victim in some way, you know, like, and he was our greatest ally, and now like, you know, they're helping the Muslims. I found some article like that was, I think, even before the scandal broke, like I want to say, was it even in the real BCCI agenda, Islam, from the New York Times. No, yeah, it's very, very sinister.
Wow.
Unfortunately, they're giving me their stupid paywall. They're trying to make me subscribe. Yeah.
They're terrified that
yeah,
it's a secret Muslim agenda.
It actually was after that. It's pretty interesting. Yeah. It says when Clark M. Clifford and Robert A. Altman, who we'll talk about, throughout, were indicted on criminal charges stemming from their involvement with the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, most of the world's attention was focused on the financial issues. But while BCCI, which has been accused here and abroad of money laundering, fraud, bribery, and many other banking irregularities, made billions of dollars for its founders and millions of dollars is charged for Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman, whose bank, I think, they were like the chairman and some other like major, they both had like, high ranking officer positions in the First American Bank, which was like, there's a whole debate of whether like BCCI like owned it. And that was like a big indictment of them that they illegally owned First American Bank through all these like, maneuvers. And that was like one of the things that really led to BCCI going down in flames in the way that it did. But I feel like, is First American Bank still around? Like, were they forced to close? I feel like they weren't. Are they still around?
I don't know.
Sure.
That aspect of the story is super interesting, and I think we'll probably get into it later because that went through a bunch of different name changes. It was called at various it was subsidiaries of subsidiaries and buyouts and things like that. But it is one of the sussest kind of. This is a bank from Washington D.C. that I don't think it's like around anymore in the sense that it was when it was allegedly connected to BCCI. I don't know if it went down with it. I mean, some of the main American figures were indicted and prosecuted. So in that sense, like their spot did get blown up a little bit. People like Clark Clifford and Robert Altman.
Well, Clark Clifford got off because he was so old. He was going to be prosecuted, but he was like just too old. Yeah,
which I think is why they were willing to
overwhelmingly. The people who went down were like the Pakistani employees of the bank, which is another thing. Like the people who really were to blame, like didn't suffer in the way that they should have.
This has real, and I feel like there's so many connections, but it has real like taken out Manuel Noriega vibes, which is like funny because Noriega was like intimately connected to the BCCI.
Yes,
or
exactly.
like the money flows were like very connected, and
but apparently by total happenstance,
this idea that suddenly you woke up one morning and decide Noriega is like a dangerous drug trafficker and we have to go invade his country and like take him out, but maybe you're actually doing like a cleanup operation because he has blackmail on like everybody in the White House and you need to like he served his purpose, you need to take him out of the game kind of thing. And I feel like the fact that basically that the sort of federal attack on BCCI and the invasion of Panama and the invasion of the Gulf War, this is all happening in like 1990, 1991, when our favorite blue blood is president, George Herbert Walker Bush, who is like so nebulously connected to all of these players that it's almost hilarious.
Yeah, but I think this NYT article, I'm going to keep reading it because this really gives you, this is why like the tone of this is part of the reason why I feel like, it brings to light a lot of the stuff that I think is important to kind of appreciate about the sort of positioning of BCCI and why like it's a relevant detail in like everything that happened. It's not just like a random corrupt bank that serves as like a nexus for all these sus people. I feel like it is in many ways like a scapegoat, and you can see like it really happening very clearly in this. Like, so they write, even though, it made millions of dollars for its founders and for Mr. Clifford, Mr. Altman, the aim of its main mission was not financial. The aim of BCCI from the outset was to put forward a radical Islamic political agenda and to support third world causes. From the beginning, BCCI's founder, Pakistani businessman Agha Hasan Abedi, a member of the ultra-religious, quasi-secret Sufi sect, made plain the bank's ideological bent. He and other bank officials openly discussed their political and religious mission. In my opinion, it is unlikely that Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman were unaware of BCCI's political and ideological activities. Mr. Abedi's claim for BCCI was for it to acquire enough political power to compete with, and even dominate, Western financial institutions. As investigators in Britain and the United States have showed, Mr. Abedi wanted to use BCCI's money to gain a measure of control over Western political institutions as well. One of the ways BCCI tried to gain political and ideological influence was through the media. To do that, Mr. Abedi bankrolled publications like South Magazine, a now defunct economic and political magazine aimed at the elite of the third world. Oh no, like a financial magazine for people in the third world? The evil. British investigators say BCCI was also financed a regular opinion column on the Middle East that was published in Britain's Manchester Guardian newspaper. In the United States, according to disclosures made during last year's Senate subcommittee hearings chaired by Senator John Kerry, Democrat of Massachusetts, BCCI indirectly aided in the purchase of several cable television systems and tried to buy more. Wow. BCCI accomplishes political as well as its financial goals. It is charged by bribing prominent citizens as well as high government officials so they would act on the bank's behalf, as Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman allegedly did. Both were charged in the recent criminal indictments with accepting bribes and lying to the Federal Reserve to conceal BCCI's ownership of First American Bankshares, Inc., Washington's largest bank. According to investigators, bribing was BCCI's modus operandi. BCCI had plenty of cash, millions from drug traffickers and approximately $1 billion of unrecorded banking deposits from Islamic countries, principally Saudi Arabia. According to British investigators, these funds were used under contractual stipulation for commodity investments according to the strictures of Islamic law. So a thing about like that people might not appreciate is that like, you know, there's a very strong Islamic prescription against usury. Sorry, I don't know why I'm always doing like it's a bear. Always somehow is happening to me. Anyway, so usury or riba. So like Islamic banking loans can't do interest, but usually how this works is that like there's some kind of loophole. Like BCCI said like, oh, I'm just gifting you this extra money. It's not interest, but like, you know, they didn't really have like a fully realized alternative model. It was like, which is often the case with a lot of like, quote unquote, like Sharia banking like today. But anyway, so that's probably what they mean by commodity investments according to the strictures of Islamic law, like making it as scary as possible when it's basically like, you know, just like the massive infusion of unrecorded deposits provided BCCI with a distinct advantage over its Western counterparts. Okay. According to British investors, BCCI was the bank for the Islamic fundamentalists, as well as for terrorist groups like Abu Nidal and Shining Path, the violent Maoist terrorist organization operating in Peru. It is also charged that BCCI's special services lured criminals, drug lords, and corrupt politicians into its sway. Its services on their behalf included falsification of documents and intricate shell game transactions to siphon off financial resources from central banks. BCCI was also a major catalyst in the transfer and sales of strategic weapons, including nuclear military technology from the West and ballistic missiles from China to third world countries, especially Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, as documented by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and by the House Republican Research Committee on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare. Mr. Abedi's major contribution to furthering radical causes like those of Abu Nidal was to use an international bank as a political instrument. What he put in place through BCCI was allowed to continue for 19 years while the world's banking community and government sat back, and in some cases, watched. Yes, that's what they were doing. They were sitting back. That was the extent of their involvement. Yeah. It was this misplaced sense of realism on the part of governments. Interesting, you know, the critique of realism that we're hearing again today, including the United States, that allowed BCCI to grow to such global proportions before being shut down. It is also what gave BCCI the resources to draw people like Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman into its web. Yeah, I'm looking forward to like just exploring in more detail how like this web was in fact like actively built by like the American intelligence community, in particular the CIA. Yeah. But you can see how like the sort of discourse around this as the biggest bank fraud in history, which like, you know, is like no.
I would say the biggest one that was like fully publicized and embraced as real and punished to some extent. Sure.
Yeah,
you could
maybe
say that. But
maybe prior to 2008, maybe.
Well, exactly. I mean, like how much drug money goes through all the major banks like HSBC and Deutsche Bank and Bank of America. Do we want to talk about them a little bit?
Yeah, exactly.
They had a little something to do with BCCI.
They did. They were involved, But, you know, a lot of people will say they knew that it didn't smell right to them. They could tell this was just a bunch of, you know, nonsense. But
whatever.
Somehow they got hooked in.
By the way, it was interesting looking back over like Bank of America. Like I tried to look into their history a little bit, and by the way, like I totally forgot that they were from San Francisco originally. I always associated them with Charlotte, but it's really a different company in North Carolina merged with them in 1999. Very much like Kinney National Parking Company, like buying Warner Communications and then changing its name to Warner. You know, it's like it just like ripped off the face of B of A because it was more well known and put it on itself and stuff. And it was started as like an Italian American like immigrant bank by I think A.P. Giannini. But now it's like its lineage, it's merged so many times that it has the lineages of like 10 different banks, some of which go back to like Boston in like the 1700s. But so the WASPs got in eventually. But it was interesting reading about like the maneuvers that BCCI had to do in terms of like penetrating the American market, just how many banking regulations there still were in the 1980s, and how I feel like if any congressperson got up today and advocated to like reinstate the banking reforms of like 1953 or 56 or stuff that was in place in the 80s, like they would be like taken out and like shot or something. Like it would be so unthinkable to like, how could you restrict the free flow of like business and capital? Like you basically couldn't have in the 80s, they talked about this, like you couldn't have interstate banking. Like you couldn't have a bank own branches in more than one state, which is very like now we have like big four banks basically. I mean, so many small ones got wiped out, starting with the savings and loan crisis, and then every recession since then has basically wiped out all these like small banks, and then there's been all this consolidation. So now you have like four that are all national and international, and there's like no barriers between states. So really, we're kind of in like a much more of a financial Wild West than we were back in like 1980 or like the late 70s. There still were plenty of ways to do such shit and get around things, but like you couldn't quite go at it as aggressively. Like that would come later with I guess first the deregulation of the S&Ls, I think in the early 80s, which led to that huge fraud crisis. And then like the repeal of Glass-Steagall and all the shit that Clinton did, he'll come up later, in the 90s to really deregulate the banking sector and just make it like a free-for-all. So, they had to operate in a slightly more restricted era, but they still got quite a lot of stuff done. Oh, by the way, I found an article. It's been deleted off Baltimore Sun, but it did say in 1993, first American to sell mortgage subsidiary.
I say.
So they sold themselves to a North Carolina banking company. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the company that eventually became Bank of America. That wouldn't surprise me, because eventually
I wonder if their like investors got reimbursed, unlike all the people throughout like mostly the third world who like didn't get their money back after BCCI crumbled.
Well, seeing as they got sold, they did lose hundreds of millions of dollars in like I think 1991. So they had a disastrous year. They were investigated by the feds repeatedly for their connections to BCCI, but then they were able to sell themselves to a North Carolina bank. So they did get paid out and didn't go to jail, except for maybe Clifford and Altman. But for the most part, they seemed to get away pretty all right.
Did Altman go to jail? Clifford didn't, because he was old and he like got sick.
I'd have to check if Altman actually did end up going.
It's hard to find out if Robert Altman, he was an American lawyer and video game executive. Yes, this is the right guy.
And also married to, this is hilarious, married to Wonder Woman. Did you catch that?
Wait, Gal Gadot?
Robert Altman was.
Oh,
and by the way, not the director Robert Altman. This is Robert A. Altman.
Yes, exactly.
The lawyer. No, but
like the old Wonder Woman.
Yeah, in False Prophets, no, he married Linda Carter.
Oh, right.
And apparently he and Linda Carter became these socialites on the DC circuit, because the book said that she was always just like a second-rate, like like a B-list TV actress in Hollywood. But then when she went to DC, I guess they were all a bunch of little like Marvel soy boys back then. They just all soy faced and were like, "Oh, Wonder Woman!" And they invited her all these parties, and she became very buddy. Like that couple, they became like a power couple in DC during the peak BCCI years.
So this is what happened. Clifford was in poor health. He was severed from the case as he was physically unable to go to trial. Altman maintained his innocence, refused offers of a plea to resolve the cases, and insisted on going to trial. In the summer of 1993, after a 5-month trial, the court dismissed a central count in the indictment of bribery, saying no evidence is presented by the government to support it. Altman declined to present a defense case and was acquitted by the jury of all remaining charges. The Department of Defense dismissed the companion federal indictment. The civil suit by the Federal Reserve was settled, with Altman agreeing to be banned permanently from banking. So then he resumed his Washington, D.C. legal practice. And he co-founded ZeniMax Media with Bethesda Softworks founder Christopher Reaver, a suslord who has come up before, I believe.
What was his background?
He's like the CEO of Bethesda, which makes like Elder Scrolls, and I think they do like Fallout and shit. But he's like into like mind control and like weird like stuff like that. Like I remember reading. But yeah, anyway, so apparently they work together to create a new parent company of Bethesda, ZeniMax Media. So he's fine.
Jesus. Okay.
He was fine. He's dead now. He died in 2021 after endorsing Hillary Clinton in 2015 for president.
Oh, isn't that nice?
With his wife, Linda Carter. His family friend since 1983, of course.
Wow. Yeah. No, they were hanging out with everybody.
So anyway, no, he didn't suffer. It was only a bunch of Pakistani employees who went down in flames.
I did find out who First American Bankshares was sold to. They were sold to First Union Corporation from Charlotte, North Carolina, which very interestingly merged with Wachovia Bank. Remember them? On September 4th, 2001. Just in time for a certain event to happen. And then Wachovia, so sadly, would get wiped out in 2008, wouldn't they? And then get taken over by Wells Fargo. But the merger of First Union and Wachovia made Wachovia Corporation one of the largest financial holding companies in the U.S., and just prior to that, they had acquired Core States Financial Corporation, headquartered in Philadelphia, which was the largest merger in U.S. banking history. Core States traced its history to 1781 and the Bank of North America, the first bank chartered in the United States. Once the merger finalized, First Union claimed 1781 as its founding date. No. See, that seemed to be a thing with all these. Even Bank of America did that, where they acquired like a Boston banking branch that is like, ooh, we were founded in like they're like getting their son Bankers of the American Revolution cards like validated. But that is also, I'm noticing a pattern here of like any American bank that puts like first, it's like they're flexing in a way. It's like we were here first. Like these are the evil, like wasps and bleeding edge that know that 9/11 is going to happen, kind of thing. Which we'll get to that later, because I mean, honestly, a lot of people probably, especially in this field, probably did see it coming. But anyways, before we get too ahead of ourselves,
so I mean, I kind of I think we'll draw on some of what this book outlawed. But there's a lot of sus stuff in this book. Most of it, I feel like you kind of have to read between the lines to get to. But I have a little bit of an axe to grind with like some of this shit. So I just want to read some of this, like about, this is, where the story begins anyway. So we might as well like read some of it. So anyway, this is some more stuff that they have to say about Abedi. So the story of Agha Hasan Abedi begins 65 years before his birth in the town of Mahmudabad in the glittering Muslim kingdom of Ouad in the north-central India. Ouad was one of the most powerful kingdoms of the Mughal Empire, which had ruled large sections of India since the 17th century. The Mughals were Muslims, a small but powerful minority group in an otherwise Hindu and Parsi India. Yeah, right. Everyone else in India was Hindu. In the early part of the 19th century, the British conquest of India had encroached most violently against this group. And in I don't know if it was most violent against them, but anyway, in 1857, the Muslims of north-central India, including those under the rule of the Raja of Mahmudabad, made one last bloody attempt to reclaim the power and influence they had lost. This insurrection, which became known to every British schoolchild as the Great Mutiny, though its Islamic participants still call it the War of Independence, was brutally suppressed by the British, thus shattering completely the political power of the kingdoms of the old Mughal Raj. More than 1 million died in religious riots. One of the victims of this vast paroxysm of Muslim violence was Agha Hasan Abedi's great-grandfather. He had been a courtier to the Raja of Mahmudabad, part of a class of well-educated Urdu-speaking senior and petty bureaucrats who managed the ruler's estates and took care of the details of official business. For his participation in the mutiny and disloyalty to the British Raj, Abedi's forebear was hanged in a cage in the streets of Lucknow to serve as an example to the rest of the insurgents. By the time of Abedi's birth in that same city in 1922, the remnants of the powerful Islamic kingdoms had fallen into a long and gentle decline. Stripped of most of their political power by the British, isolated in a sea of Hindi culture, the Rajas were nonetheless tolerated to manage their lands, collect their taxes, and operate as satraps in the British Empire. And Abedi's family continued to do what it had done for generations, serve the Rajas of Mahmudabad as administrators, revenue officers, and private secretaries. In 1922, the decadent, princely state of Mahmudabad was still one of the largest and richest in northern India, and despite the ravages of the mutiny, its rulers could still trace their lineage back to the grand and powerful Mughals of the 17th century. From a golden throne in a vaulted palace, the Raja collected more than $1 million a year from 530 villages and uncounted thousands of hamlets. Yeah, I guess, but all that money was actually like put back into India and not stolen and taken to Britain. But anyway, well, back in the past it was. Though Abedi's father and grandfather had never risen to the rank of senior advisors to the Rajas, they were considered to be among the inner circle of confidence. As such, they both had solid, respectable middle-class status and a view of the shimmering luxury of the Rajas' lives. He goes on a little bit. So it was in this culture that Agha Hasan Abedi lived until he was in his early 20s. As a child, he'd listened to the tales of Baroque luxuries, of the glory days of the Mughal Raj, of the bloody struggle against the British conquest. He also grew up intensely aware of his status as a double minority. Not only was Abedi a Muslim, Muslims made up only 20% of the population of north-central India. Okay, so it's gone from a sea of Hindi culture to... well, anyway, but also he was a Shiite Muslim, Sikh, Sikh as in, that's what they wrote, as in all the British, and in all of British-ruled India, Shiites accounted for only 15% of Muslims. This is one of the worst parts of this whole thing. The Shia are to Islam what puritanical fundamentalists are to mainstream Christianity. A minority sect known for its obsessive attention to work, politics, and religion. In contrast to the more dispassionate and detached Sunni Muslims, the Shia are passionately... This is like so insane. I can't deal with it. This is from 1993, so it really goes to show 90s. Like how... like, and people like read this... like this is like a thing. Like people like read this book to understand like BCCI and what happened and like... the like absurdity of this like is about a topic that is like so important like in just world history and like just the like it just anyway like the Shia are passionately demonstrative and are fond of putting on elaborate shows of penance and mourning. The Shia have a mystical bent as well, reflected in their devotion to martyrdom, belief in saints, and worship at the tombs of holy men. Shia Islam is more political as well. As in Khomeini's revolutionary Iran, Abedi's family were intensely religious, teetotaling Shiites, I'm just going to go with what they wrote, who dutifully observed all Islamic rites. Islam pervaded and would continue to pervade every corner of Abedi's life. So just like to clarify, like Shia aren't like the extreme Muslims, like a different sect of Islam based on like, they actually are a sect unlike Sufis. Basically everything that says, I mean, there is definitely like more, the practice of tomb visitation, which used to be more generally widespread in Islam, is now, definitely more popular among Shia. I mean, all Muslims, like many Muslims believe in saints. Many Muslims like visit tombs still. Many Sunnis do. And pretty much all Muslims uphold martyrs. There definitely is a tradition of penance and mourning among the Shia, but like the idea that Sunnis are more dispassionate and detached and less political is interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Well, that seems to be kind of like
and more mystical. Like
I feel like there's a lot of, you still see it to this day, but like Iranian Revolution brain with people from America that are writing about this, because it's just like they weren't paying attention to anything until this like bearded, mullah like took
Yes,
over our
exactly.
embassy and like told us he hated us and said death to America. And so now it's like everything's filtered to, like, who are the Shiites? Oh, they're like the Iranian, they're like the religious ones. And then like, oh, the Sunni, it's like, have you seen the Saudi royal family? Like, I know they're
Yeah.
hypocrites, but like on the surface, they're very like
or like the entire movement for Pakistan to exist in the first place. Like, as he wrote, like, Shia aren't the majority of Muslims in India. So like, who were the very political Muslims driving the genesis of this Islamic state?
yeah.
Like,
Who?
I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't know. But anyway, so I'm trying to see if like there's anything like super relevant to read here in the interest of time. It talks about his love of falconry and everything. I mean, I guess that like gives an interesting picture of like his early life. But that type of stuff, like, that's not 100% unique to Betty and Gwyn really either. Like, we read that article, like their true agenda, Islam. And there's another one in the WAPO, I think, from around the time that was like, it was called BCCI's Abedi, A Courtier's Ruin. It's the same thing where it's like 10-foot oil portraits of Queen Victoria and the bejeweled Rajas of Mahmudabad stare out on darkened dining and dancing halls, swathed in dust, in the flaking palatial ruins of what once was one of the richest and most dynamic kingdoms of the Indian subcontinent. Okay, I wonder why it stopped being rich. I wonder what happened. What could it... Anyway, in Mahmudabad, Muslim Rajas administered great tracts of land from a gold and silver throne. Same, like, framing, the gold throne. They financed idealistic politicians such as Mohandas Gandhi and Pakistan's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. They doled out gifts to their subjects, paid stipends and renowned poets and intellectuals, plotted against the British Empire, and finally witnessed the birth of two of the modern world's most impoverished post-colonial nations, India and Pakistan. Abedi and nearly all of BCCI's senior executives migrated as young adults from what is now India to the newly independent Islamic nation of Pakistan in 1947 and 1948, when the British Empire in the subcontinent and the kingdoms such as Mahmudabad, through which the British had ruled South Asia, fell amid bloody religious riots. In Pakistan, Abedi and other refugees confronted the challenge of building 20th century institutions from scratch in a culture still rooted in 17th century feudalism. Among other things, Pakistan at its birth had no large banks and very few bankers. That is true. And it did put them in a position where they could easily be preyed upon by the large banks that did exist elsewhere. But the idea that that's a travesty, it's a very old concept, the fact that what really, really the roots of this go so deep, but I don't know.
You hear the idea that, the implication humming beneath the surface of all of this is the colonialism is really for these people's best own benefit. It was for their own good. And once they left, the tragedy. Oh,
yeah.
No. It's even if
and they reverted back to their old ways of not knowing anything. And that's how this happened.
Exactly. The only thing, we tried to civilize them. We tried, and then they don't mention how, I think when France pulled out of, I think it was Upper Volta / Burkina Faso, they ripped all of they ripped the phones out of the wall and took everything and disconnected all the electricity and were fuck you. Oh, fine. You want us to go? Well, So, there's nothing like that happen. That's not relevant.
This actually reminds me a little bit. Actually, hold on. Let me grab a book from my shelf quickly, because this reminded me a little bit of one passage that has always stuck with me. Hold on. I think I actually have this bookmarked from a while ago. But reading about BCCI, I feel this is interesting context. It's a little bit afield from our sources, but this is from a book I've mentioned on the podcast before. It's Restating Orientalism by Willa Halak. And basically, the main argument of this book is about, Edward Said. It's kind of a critique of him and how he was, super focused on, the idea of, representation and literature and things like that without really giving a proper account of, the institutions in which, Orientalism as an academic field was embedded. And he talks a little bit about, the economic ruin that was inflicted on a lot of these countries in sort of the Islamic world that happened beforehand, which I think is interesting context. And I think it's something, that most it's something that I think most kind of accounts of BCCI, the context of it, even going back to 1922 and the ruins of this post-feudal society, don't quite appreciate Halak writes, the direct and indirect imposition of the state in the Muslim world has largely gone unnoticed as a field of inquiry. Like its Western parent, the Muslim state, that is, the state in the Muslim world, was deeply embedded within latent assumptions of natural progress, and was therefore seen as a natural and timeless phenomenon. This is in part due to the ideological formations to which the Western state itself was subject, but it was also because it developed through various stages of impositions over a century. In other words, both in British India and especially in the Ottoman Empire, the modern state arose by virtue of its institutions, together with the ideological props that cushioned and legitimized them by necessity. Conversely put, it was the so-called reforms of the 19th century that created the state structure, not the other way around. The reforms, rarely, if at all, seem to produce such effects, precisely because the modern state lives in an ideological web, were far more potent and effective than even the critical historian has accredited them. They were not a series of acts that just changed the law, education, administration, and similar spheres, however important these are. They had the effect of raising a state, which, as it was evolving, designed and implemented them. The process was clearly dialectical, which explains why the first reforms in the Ottoman Empire were what one might call ordinary reforms, but reforms that strengthened the physical might of the proto-state, a precondition for developing the status of a legitimate monopoly over violence and the threat to use it. And he talks about the institution of the waqf, which is very important economic institution in Islam, prior to colonialism. So he writes, before proceeding, he explains it is important to understand the magnitude of this phenomenon. The institution of the waqf in Muslim lands had over centuries effectively cemented the relationship between the human, physical, educational, economic elements within society, and to some extent the polity. A thoroughly pious institution, it formed that substrate and matrix of philanthropy in Islam, playing an important role in the redistribution of wealth. One gave up one's property, quote, for the sake of God, a charitable act that meant offering aid and support to the needy. This later defined in a broad sense and ordained by the Quran as integral to the ethical formation and constitution of the individual. It also provided for the distribution of wealth within the family, affording care for its members and preventing the fragmentation of family property. The promotion of education through the waqf represented one of the best forms of engaging in good works, essential for Islam's social welfare and ethos of cultivating the moral technologies of the self. A considerable proportion of charitable trusts were thus directed at madrasas, colleges, although waqf provided significant contributions toward building mosques, colleges, Sufi orders, hospitals, public fountains, soup kitchens, travelers' lodges, street lighting, and a variety of public works, notably bridges. The list of social services provided for by waqf is expansive. A substantial part of the budget is intended for such philanthropies, was dedicated to the maintenance, daily operational costs, and renovation of waqf properties. A typical waqf consisted of a mosque and rental property, for example shops, the rent from which supported the operation and maintenance of the mosque. A striking fact about the waqf was the volume of property dedicated to it across Islamic regions. By the 18th century, it is estimated more than half the real property in the empire was consecrated as waqf. That's the Ottoman Empire, I believe. Depending on the region, an estimated 40 to 60% of all real property across the Islamic world was constituted as waqf by the time Europe began its colonialist encroachments. The Ottoman government's economic and political gains were thus enormous. An increasingly centralized government had become the middleman who secured considerable profits in the process of collecting the revenues and endowments, and then, back from the center, dwindling salaries were paid for the middle upkeep and operation of the waqf foundations. The back payments to the educational sector progressively declined, talking about what happened post-colonialism, reaching a near zero point by the middle of the 1850s. Waqf money, formerly and for centuries belonging to the autonomous waqfs, which then used them for their own operations and the fulfillment of their mission, were now diverted to military and other state-building projects such as railways, through which the grip of the central government over the periphery was enhanced, this being a replica of what happened in Europe, except that the process in the Ottoman Empire and other Islamic regions was condensed. Waqf property and the institutions it supported, including those of the Sharia, began to fall seriously into ruin. This process was not unique, however. Nearly all Islamic regions suffered a similar fate. In due course, it will become clear that the French campaign against Algerian waqfs was the model that the Ottomans were forced to emulate, a campaign that was designed, justified, and rationalized through French Orientalism. And, he talks about how the sort of attack on this idea, the idea of the waqf, was the sort of upheaval of this, or the uprooting of this economic institution, was sort of the goal of a lot of this Orientalist writing. It wasn't just about depicting Muslims as like ugly or stupid caricatures. It really was about sort of convincing people to change this, to uproot this sort of economic system. Like he writes, the French Orientalists, like their British and Dutch counterparts who co-founded the very discipline of Orientalism, proved themselves to be more than instrumental in their government's colonial designs. In the government's bid to seize control of waqf properties on which countless religious institutions were founded, France's heavyweight Orientalists not only helped in matters pertaining to legislation, but also effectively campaigned, in the words of an American Orientalist, to discredit the institution among Algerians themselves. Intended to conquer the minds, this campaign was as central to the project of colonialism as economic gain, for the project, as I have been arguing, was not confined to capitalism, however important it was to Europe. The project heavily invested in the production of cultural and academic discourse and the creation of new subjectivities in European-like subjects. So, they even use like the Quran to insist that the family waqf was a later innovation, or a bid'ah, a term that you hear a lot these days. They produce like various discourses to try to destroy it, to blame, the economic stagnation that they were experiencing, not on colonialism, but on this, this age-old institution. But it's interesting, how you can see in the sort of framing or the language around that was used around BCCI, like the emphasis on family, the emphasis on charity and philanthropy, how this is something that is still felt as kind of in a way being missing. I think that it's not 100% wrong to identify that as being the case, that like in some way, this does come out of not like, Islamic barbarity or like mysticism or anything like that, but out of a sense of, the sort of a deeply rooted economic model, like an economic linchpin that was systematically destroyed because they, wanted to do other things and to optimize their economies for their own benefit under the colonial governments, that is.
Yeah, there were self-serving reasons for undermining this and like a massive on top.
Yeah, it was a massive on top. And part of it was like this Orientalist language that you see being used all around this. And it's not just like a matter of being like, you're being Islamophobic. It's like literally this is the continuation of a discourse that was created as propaganda for destroying the economic institutions of this world.
And behind this whole calamity, one man. A man who built this banking empire, who befriended presidents, prime ministers, potentates. A man who is now accused of pulling off one of the great crimes of the century. This man, Agha Hasan Abedi, he was BCCI, a worldly, well-connected Pakistani who at the height of his power was a spellbinding, hypnotic figure to some occult leader. Abedi said he had a vision of an Arab bank that would be the largest in the world.
He was clearly a charismatic character. He was able to, I think, persuade a great number of people, employees and others, to support this vision of his. And I think initially it was successful.
And in the feudal desert sheepthings of the Middle East, the Abedi vision of a world-renowned Arab bank took hold. Abedi dazzled the sheiks and got $9 billion from one man alone, Zayed, the ruler of Abu Dhabi. Abedi was in action. He set up banks around the world where few questions were asked and where corrupt politicians took bribes to put their country's money into the bank.
If you had a criminal enterprise and needed to move money, support the criminal enterprise, arrange payoffs, arrange for currencies in difficult places, arrange to get around laws anywhere, this was a bank that would help you.
BCCI became the bank of General Manuel Noriega of Panama and set up secret accounts to hide the general's money. BCCI laundered profits of the cocaine bosses, hiding much of the money in phony commodities trading. BCCI maintained accounts in London to fund the activities of Abu Nadal and other Mideast terrorists. And seized BCCI documents show that Abedi and top BCCI bankers siphoned off billions for themselves, setting up phony loans on the books.
There were these fictitious accounts created, and the bank then started engaging in drug money laundering and other criminal activities.
The money was disappearing at least as fast as it came in, and probably faster. And this was all accomplished through a whole mechanism of multiple banks, multiple corporations, a tangled web so difficult to follow that almost no one could, including his own people. In the end, there wasn't any bank underneath all of these deposits. There's no there then.
But all the while, Abedi was able to pass himself off as a man of vision and good works. He showed up at the United Nations, gave out prizes from the BCCI Foundation, and came to be known as a philanthropist and confidant of some of the world's great men. How could anyone think that such a man or his bank could be corrupt? Former presidential advisor Clark Clifford was Abedi's man in Washington and his lawyer. Former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Andrew Young, worked for Abedi as a consultant. Former British Prime Minister James Callaghan accompanied Abedi on economic missions. And perhaps most impressive of all the men seen with Abedi, a former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Carter flew around the world with Abedi, with millions of dollars from BCCI to promote good works in the Third World.
The Bank of Credit and Commerce is unique among all the banks that I've ever dealt with. They are major sponsors.
Mr. Carter may not have known it, but he became BCCI's most important ambassador. And law enforcement authorities now say BCCI used Carter's trips to Africa to further its larger, grander scheme.
It's obviously focused on people who would have, from BCCI's point of view, a good market value in the areas where they were looking to develop depositors. Was it that cynical? I think so.
Prosecutor John Moscow is running the BCCI investigation in New York. And he says in one case, after a Carter trip to Africa, he set up a program to eradicate the deadly parasite known as the guinea worm. He demanded and got special exemptions from local laws.
They would cash in on what appeared to be good works in the Third World. They would do the good works and then say, and by the way, would you please do me the favor of exempting me from customs inspection, payment of taxes, which means they can move money in and out all the time, anywhere they wanted. Money, drugs, goods, yes.
President Carter continued to accept millions of dollars from Abedi and BCCI for Carter's good works, long, long after the bank had been implicated in the world's biggest financial scandal.
Well, Brian, you see that. We should mention right away that we asked Jimmy Carter to come on the program, but he declined to participate. But what does he say now?
I don't want to say much. What he has said when we tried to track him down was that he believed BCCI made contributions that further his projects, which were of an important purpose he felt in Africa. And that's about it. He did say to me at one point, I don't condone any criminal activity. But he said this long after the bank had pleaded guilty to drug money laundering charges, and it was clear the bank was at that point very corrupt.
All right. Well, how were the BCCI bankers able to reach people of such prominence and power? We'll find out more about that a little later in the morning. But first, the bank and intelligence agencies, including ours. Who was using whom?
I think we'll kind of get into the 1970s action at this point. And this brought to the fore a really interesting character, kind of political fixer, who I actually had never heard about his story before. And in a way, I feel like there is this weird era of like presidential scandals after Watergate and before Reagan in the Ford and Carter administrations that you just don't. Apparently, if you go back and like read the actual newspaper articles at the time, they were scandals, but they all seem to have been quite forgotten about. Like I'm thinking about like Koreagate, where like members of the Moonies were like bribing congressmen to like give money to Korea, shit like that. Like that was a kind of a big deal under Ford. And then there were things like Billygate, where I believe Jimmy Carter sent his brother Billy. I think he was doing some kind of strange business deals with Libya, and which is kind of interesting in light of all of this. But I had never heard of the first scandal to hit the new Carter administration, which was called Lancegate. And it all circled around this interesting character named Bert Lance, who the book False Prophets goes pretty in depth into Bert Lance's sort of connections in Washington and his eventual connections with an assortment of like BCCI personalities and entities. Maybe I'll just read from chapter 3 a little bit to give people an idea of who Bert Lance is, because this is also where you see, in terms of like the Contra tentacles, you see it reach into sort of the Democratic Party milieu, you know, not just the Republican. And also, I mean, because this is relevant again and again, like Southern Democrats, I see y'all out here, really do seem to be like a vector for like financial corruption. Not to say that Northern Democrats or Democrats from anywhere else like weren't, but when I think about like people like Bert Lance and then like Bill Clinton and then the people around him, they all seem to actually be tied up with like the same types of networks. In some cases, literally the same networks, as we'll see shortly. But I'll just read here. It's hard to imagine a more unlikely pair than Agha Hasan Abedi and Bert Lance. While Abedi appeared refined and cultivated, Lance was almost the stereotype of the Southern good old boy. There was also a striking physical contrast. Abedi had an average build, but the Georgia banker was a bear of a man, weighing 240 pounds and standing 6'4". However, Lance and Abedi also had much in common. They both had a knack for making political connections, and they both played fast and loose with banking regulations. These two characteristics were related. Both men used their banks to acquire political clout. Lance was born in 1931 in Georgia. He dropped out of college in 1950 to marry his childhood sweetheart, LaBelle David, then worked as a teller at Calhoun First National Bank, there's First again, which had been founded by LaBelle's grandfather. 7 years later, Lance and a group of investors bought control of the bank, and he ultimately became its chairman. One of the most popular men in town, Lance was utterly unlike the image of the conservative banker. Friends and neighbors found him an easy touch, and he lent liberally to himself and his relatives as well. In 1966, Lance made the most important political connection of his life when he met a dynamic young Georgia politician, James Earl Carter Jr., known to everyone as Jimmy. At the time, Carter was a state senator running for governor. Lance became an important campaign supporter and contributor. They eventually became best friends. Carter is likened Lance to a brother. Although Carter lost in 1966, he won 4 years later, thanks in part to Lance's help. After he took office, he appointed Lance to the post of Highway Commissioner. Lance enjoyed his stint in state government and made an unsuccessful bid for the Democratic nomination for governor in 1974 as Carter's chosen successor. It was later discovered that Lance's campaign committees wrote hundreds of bad checks against accounts at Calhoun First National and that the bank cleared them. Although Lance failed to gain higher political office, his career as a banker flourished when he was recruited by Financial General Bankshares, that'll come up, FGB, a bank holding company based in Washington, D.C. FGB was an unusual institution. Although the McFadden Act forbade American banks to engage in interstate banking, FGB had been granted a special exemption and owned banks in several states. In most cases, it held a majority of the stock, with local investors owning the rest. So FGB is the bank that I think would turn into First American, but it's in a very complicated way. But anyways, in January 1975, Lance became president of the National Bank of Georgia, NBG, FGB's subsidiary in Atlanta. 5 months later, he and a group of investors bought control of the bank from FGB, and he was named chairman. As head of NBG, Lance became friendly with one of the most important financiers in the South, Jackson T. Stevens, the president and a controlling shareholder of Stevens, Inc. of Little Rock, Arkansas, one of the largest brokerage firms in the country. Lance and Stevens met in 1975. It was around that time that Stevens, Inc. managed a public offering of NBG stock. Quote, their common interests, one acquaintance said, were Jimmy Carter, a Naval Academy classmate of Stevens's, banking, money, religion, both Southern Baptist, and Democratic politics, a reporter noted later. Not only was Lance a contributor to Carter in 1976, his bank was the biggest single lender to the Carter family's peanut warehouse business. The debt,
right.
I know, right? Everyone thought the peanut thing was clean, but nope. Seed oil mafia stay winning. So the debt to NBG.
Peanuts. I guess they are seeds. Peanut oil. Is
They
like
add seed oil to it. Those
Oh
sickos.
no!
Yeah, I know. The debt to NBG reached as high as $4.7 million. It was later alleged that these loans amounted to de facto financing of the presidential campaign, which would have been illegal. After an investigation, Carter was cleared of wrongdoing. Lance also let the Carter campaign use NBG's corporate plane without disclosing it as a contribution. The campaign was fined for this violation. After Carter was elected, he brought Lance to Washington as director of the Office of Management and Budget, one of the most important posts in the federal government. Damn, I mean, that's not just a vanity post. That's kind of a big deal. Lance's dubious financial practices did not cause a problem when he was up for Senate confirmation, for federal officials had withheld important information about his activities from Senate investigators. A handful of journalists, notably New York Times columnist William Safire, began to dig into Lance's background and uncovered a number of apparent irregularities. It seemed that Lance had financed his purchase of NBG stock with loans from two big New York banks, Manufacturers Hanover Trust Company and Chemical Bank, and had then arranged for NBG to open correspondent banking accounts with them. In one column, Safire suggested that Lance received a $3.4 million loan from the First National Bank of Chicago, not because of his creditworthiness, but because of his closeness to Carter. This loan, according to Safire, enabled First Chicago's chairman, A. Robert Abood, to gain life and death financial control over the man closest to the president. Abood denied favoritism. Also, First National Bank of Chicago, incredibly fucking sus. In July 1977, the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, chaired by Abraham Ribicoff, a Connecticut Democrat, looked into Lance's conduct and cleared him of wrongdoing, but Ribicoff acted too soon. More allegations of misconduct emerged almost daily, engulfing the Carter administration in its first major scandal, Lancegate. On August 18th, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the main regulator of nationally chartered banks, issued a report criticizing Lance's banking practices. Since the report did not accuse Lance of breaking the law, Carter treated it as an exoneration of his friend. At a press conference with Lance, the president made a remark that later came back to haunt him. "Bert, I'm proud of you." Nonetheless, Ribicoff announced... Jimmy, okay.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, Ribicoff announced that his committee would be holding new hearings on Lance. In the meantime, there was growing pressure on Carter to fire his friend, and on Labor Day, Carter met with Ribicoff and Charles Percy of Illinois, the ranking Republican on the committee, and the senators asked the president to dismiss his budget director. Lance turned for help to... who else? Clark Clifford, one of the most respected and politically well-connected lawyers in Washington. Clifford persuaded the committee to postpone Lance's testimony to give the banker more time to prepare. So the nationally televised hearings began with a parade of witnesses who recounted Lance's dubious financial practices. Lance defended himself on September 15th in a 2-hour statement in which he lashed out at the committee for treating him unfairly. It was an impressive performance, winning him applause at the end. The New York Times observed, for the moment, he managed not only to push Senator Percy into regretful apologies about news leaks and misinterpretations, but also to win predictions from some members of the Senate committee that there would be a, quote, backlash of sympathy. Despite the rave reviews, Carter was unable to resist the pressure to fire Lance, and on September 21st accepted his resignation with, quote, regret and sorrow. But, the resignation was by no means the end of Lance's woes. He was the target of investigations by bank regulators and federal prosecutors, which led to an indictment in May 1979 on charges of violating federal banking laws. Clark Clifford's protege, Robert A. Altman, assisted Lance's defense team. A year later, the trial ended in a hung jury. On top of his legal troubles, Lance was in desperate financial straits. Around the time of his resignation, he was more than $5 million in debt, and the value of his biggest asset, his stock in National Bank of Georgia, had plummeted. His only hope was to sell the stock at well above the market price. Hope soon arrived in the person of Agha Hasan Abedi. So they say that Abedi was eager to expand into the U.S. Although he could open BCCI branches, he realized that the quickest route to growth would be through an acquisition, but there were several obstacles. One was the McFadden Act banning interstate banking. BCCI was affected because Bank of America owned a large chunk of its stock. Thus, if BCCI wanted to buy a bank in any state other than California, B of A's home, regulators would think B of A was trying to circumvent the law. Even though B of A was planning to dispose of its stock, Abedi would likely encounter opposition from regulators who were nervous about BCCI's rapid growth and its dubious banking practices. And so he decided one way around these obstacles would be for a BCCI client to take over an American bank. The first such attempt was made by a member of the Gokul family that controlled the Gulf Group, the shipping empire that Abedi had supported for years. In 1975, Abbas Gokul made an offer for Chelsea National Bank, a small institution in Manhattan, and the owners agreed to sell it to him. Before the deal could go through, the New York State Banking Department had to give its approval. When the New York regulators checked into Gokul, they were far from impressed. John Hyman, the New York State banking superintendent, later said his uncertified financial statement showed total assets of $4.5 million, of which $3 million was in the form of a loan from his sister. His reported annual income from the prior year was, as I recall, approximately $34,000. The regulators also found that Gokul had no banking experience, but very close ties to BCI. And so this prompted the regulators to take a closer look at BCCI, and they did not like what they saw. Hyman found that the BCCI group was structured in such a way that no single central bank or regulatory authority had primary responsibility for overseeing it. As Hyman and his staff dug further, they became increasingly alarmed. When they asked BCCI for details about large unsecured loans to certain Arab customers, for example, the response was typically dismissive. "It's private," they said. Quote, "It's private." Because of their wariness about BCCI's role, the regulators told Gokul's lawyer that his answers were unsatisfactory. Chelsea National was sold to someone else. And at the same time, BCCI officials were looking at another New York bank, Bank of Commerce, which was controlled by FGB, the same company that spun off NBG to Bert Lance. Let's see, so Abdus Sami worked on this deal. They met with FGB's controlling shareholder, this is big suslord alert, the retired Army General George Olmsted, and William Skyling, that's spelled the old Dutch way for astute listeners, FGB's chairman and CEO. Skyling later said that he had not been very impressed with Abedi. The BCCI chief, quote, "was not the type of banker that I would care to be associated with. I doubted his judgment, and I went in to see General Olmsted and told him, maybe he can work with the Bank of America, but as far as I am concerned, I do not wish to be associated with Mr. Abedi." One of Skyling's former colleagues says the American banker was much more blunt in private. The former colleague says Skyling pronounced the name Abedi rather than Abedi, the correct pronunciation. Quote, "I threw Abedi out of my office when he tried to buy Bank of Commerce back in the 70s, Skyling growled. He then muttered, bunch of unsavory people." That's the waspiest thing ever. And but then in late 1977, after meeting Bert Lance, Abedi finally succeeded in putting together a U.S. takeover. The matchmaker was R. Eugene Hawley, the former majority Democratic leader of the Georgia Senate and a friend of Lance's. He was more than a local politician. He was involved in a Middle Eastern oil venture. Now, this is interesting. In 1975, the evangelist Oral Roberts had introduced Hawley to Roy J. Carver, the multimillionaire chairman of Bandag Inc., a big tire retreading company. Hawley and Carver soon became involved in a project to develop an offshore oil concession granted by the government of Qatar. Okay. And so that's how they all got kind of connected to each other, looking for this like oil concession deal that for some reason Oral Roberts was like setting up with like a tire retreading kingpin. These evangelical crime, like mob lords basically laundering their money, it sounds like.
It's another weird aspect to like the whole idea of like, you know, the foreign policy manipulations of like, you know, Agha Hasan Abedi. Like a lot of the people involved in this were like, I mean, Clark Clifford himself was like basically the guy, like he had a huge role in like Israel even being a thing to this day. He was like
he's
an
very proud of
outspoken
that.
Christian Zionist.
This is the thing he was most proud about in government. Was
Yeah.
convincing Truman to recognize the state of Israel.
Yeah, exactly. So like it's a little bit weird that like, you know, this whole idea that all of these like die-hard like Muslim haters, like crusaders were like taken in by this guy and manipulated into like, I don't know, giving Pakistan a nuclear weapon, the most horrible thing ever, you know, or like
No, it really does kind of blow it out of the water. Yeah, that I figure that theory does not hold a lot of credence at all. And when you see like the religious cross-pollination between like different groups of Muslims and then the Israelis and then a bunch of like largely like Southern Baptist kind of Christians in America. That seems to be their in, which is very intriguing. You know, I mean, I guess it lines up with the broader Brzezinski Casey strategy of the 1980s of creating this like reactionary ecumenical alliance of like right-wing Jews and right-wing Muslims and like right-wing Catholics and right-wing evangelicals to all get on the same side to defeat the evil empire, you know. So, but it also like, because of that, the idea that, you know, this bank was all about spreading a nefarious like Muslim ideology is just like, okay.
Yeah, well, even
like,
at that point, like the whole, like the Brzezinski, like that whole like sort of consensus, like hadn't really like the whole like special relationship of the U.S. with Saudi Arabia. Like as you said, like a lot of this started percolating before like the big oil boom, before the consolidation of OPEC and everything. So like a lot of that stuff, like Brzezinski's like architecture of that hadn't like fully taken shape during like a lot of like this time. That kind of came into play later, you know, where it was
right. It was right on the cusp of it happening, because the same thing. This is like, you know, 1977. 78. The other thing that had been created recently was like the Safari Club by CIA Director George Bush, which I think at the time had like Saudi Arabia, it had Iran under the Shah, and I don't think it had, I forget if it had Israel like officially, but you could sort of see some of these pieces like maybe starting to align in earnest. But of course, after Casey and Reagan get in, that's when it really like kicks off in a huge way.
I think like, you know, a lot of it did kind of start happening in the Carter years for sure. But I think that a motivation in a way was to head like certain things off of the past. Like if you look at like BCCI, like there was even a concern, like part of the, you know, the arguments that were being made when it was like, you know, talking about the necessity of bringing this down and how nefarious this was, and kind of like exonerating all the Americans who were implicated, and blaming certain people. The like, you know, what their dealings with the Soviet Union also came up. Like the idea that BCCI had taken the secrets that they were getting from the CIA and given them to Russia was one of the evil things that they were supposed to have done. You know,
interesting.
So like they had their fingers like in a, you know, they were pretty promiscuous, like in terms of who like they were involved with, you know, like like where they were involved.
No, they're very promiscuous. Also, same with Bert Lance, actually, because Bert Lance apparently arranged a lot of loans from the First National Bank of Chicago, I assume in the late 70s, to the USSR. Like he made all these shady loans to the Soviets, which is like, okay. But again, you know, it's very easy to go like Bert Lance was a Soviet agent or something. But I think that kind of misses like the bigger picture going on here. And I mean, you had people like the Ed Wilson scandal, which started proliferating when Bush was CIA director, and then he was making like shady arms deals with Libya, and then he got caught for it. So like even people that we were kind of on bad terms with in the 70s, there was like a lot. I guess the 70s were just such a promiscuous decade, man. You know, like everybody was just experimenting and like, hey, maybe we'll give some grain loans to the Soviets. Like, but I think it was still done in people were jostling, and I don't think it's as simple as, I mean, I think also like the 70s almost were like, the impression I got from false prophets is that or not. Sorry, the impression I got from the other book, the Entrapment.
Oh,
book,
the Entrapment
is
from
that he
BCCI
mentions
to ISI.
Yeah, he mentions a few times actually, which is interesting. That I wish he provided more. Like he went into it a little more, provided more hard evidence, but he mentions that most of the American banks in the late 1970s were facing some real financial problems. And actually, he said, like, if they were subjected to honest accounting, they were all like bankrupt.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
they had to figure out some way. And a lot of that was, I think, due to the huge amount of like South American debt that they had on their ledger. That
I believe him. I believe Abdullah John. I think he's right.
I think he's right too, and it's very intriguing, and it actually makes more sense. Like once you start talking about the intersection between like intelligence agencies and like shady high finance and like the government and like geopolitics and all this shit, that like the international banking is like a crucial national security concern and really almost like a geopolitical concern. You know, so the idea that, and we know that the people that are going in and out of government and in and out of the banks and business and stuff are often like the same people, particularly people like Bill Casey. He was like a Wall Street lawyer, you know, and people like the Dulles brothers.
Became like, as we know, like super involved in BCCI. Like it was like, you know, his bank like towards the end, like especially like in the with regard to Afghanistan and everything.
Yeah, he would use it in like a really huge way in the 80s. And even, you know, the shady guy like banker William J. Skyling, you know, who I just mentioned. I managed to there's not much information about him, but you can find his obituary on WAPO. And it does mention that he was a high school classmate and friend of President Gerald Ford. So, you know, it's like all these motherfuckers know each other. They've all been like, of course, you know, he was in the Navy in World War II. Like, and Olmsted was like OSS. He knew all the old heads. Basically, he was part of that old gang. And I think was a successful insurance man in his own right, but then got brought back into the military during and after World War II and was raised to the rank of a general and gives off the vibe of being like a kind of deep state money manager, basically. And he was the chief shareholder of FGB and the parent company that he founded, which like has a red Wikipedia hyperlink. You cannot find shit about this company, but it was called the International Bank of Washington, D.C., which eventually all of these entities are pretty much Matryoshka dolls within the larger structure of like Olmsted's like shady banking network that for a while was called International Bank. I think by the 80s it became First American Bankshares was the name that it was kind of operating under. That's the node, I feel like, of BCCI that often gets a little bit downplayed and lost in the mix. I'm sure if I read John Kerry's 500-page BCCI report that it doesn't go as deep as it should on the international bank side, because the vibe I get from that thing is basically that this is a covert CIA bank from the get-go, absolutely 100%. And one reason why I know that it kind of has to be is, let me see where I put it here, that like the International Banking Group, the International Bank of Washington, D.C., controlled a bunch of subsidiary organizations, including, Khalid, the Liberian Maritime Registry. Isn't that interesting? They managed the Liberian Maritime Agency. And as I discovered, and I think this is in the first part of Demon Forces, that basically the Liberian Maritime Registry was literally set up by the CIA and Secretary of State Edward Stettinius Jr. To be a kind of like a Delaware for international shipping. So you could do all kinds of shady things with like front companies and nobody was going to basically look into it. The Liberian authorities, who at the time were under President Tubman, who was like super pro-US, they were just going to look the other way. But the management of the registry itself, that information was managed out of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. I forget there was like a front company. I didn't catch the name International Bank when I was reading like the Liberia sources, but apparently at some point, General George Olmsted basically acquired control over the Maritime Registry, which like just it's just like all you gotta do is put that together. Like this is like a CIA managed registry, and then this shady bank acquires the management of this registry, I don't know how long or if they ever ceased or what entity actually operates the registry now, but that's as close as like hard confirmation, I think, as you're gonna get of like a smoking gun that this is like a CIA operation that's going on. So it does, I think it raises the stakes when some of these books say that, oh, BCCI bought First American Bankshares.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, really? The CIA just let a bunch of, oil sheiks from the UAE and stuff, like,
yeah,
just buy it? Not buying that.
Right. It's pretty interesting. Like, I think one thing that I think would be interesting to bring up, like relative to the sort of like break between like the Carter era stuff and the Reagan era stuff, is I feel like that's kind of baked into the narrative that's being fed to some of the reportage on this. Like in Outlaw Bank, there's a lot of like sus informants that they have with pseudonyms. And I want to talk about like, a couple of them at least. Like there's one who's incredibly sus named whose pseudonym is Heinrich, a German guy. But first off, there's an interesting guy who works for BCCI who has a pseudonym of Ali Mirza. Talking about him, I think he's actually talking to somebody else here, but he comes up in a little bit. So he's talking to someone at BCCI saying, we only sent the creme de la creme to the United States. There were more than 100 network people there, but none of them were BCCI people. I mean, BCCI bankers. But BCCI was the brains, the paymaster, the front, and really the major operator. But you don't know if they bribed anyone? That's Beatty asking them. There were lots of Americans who were put on the payroll. These were the people we had gotten to through blackmail, extortion, bribery. I don't know who all. They were judges, state policemen, the FBI, the Justice Department, whoever we needed help from. When they had an operation, they wanted it to go smoothly. They had a saying, a dog barking with you is better than a dog barking against you. And if it is your dog, you have to throw him a piece of meat. It was easy in the United States because we knew the weakness in the United States. It was always money. You give a guy a loan and then he didn't have to pay it back. So who did you get to? Do you know anyone for a fact? Senator John Tower. They knew his weaknesses. They sent him women, young beauties from Lahore, and they got videos and films. Did you see any of these videotapes? No, but I heard them talk about this in meetings. They talked about President Carter. It was a big thing about money to Carter. So again, this is in the third person. So it says, Beatty kept taking word for word notes, but on this subject, Masri seemed only to be repeating BCCI gossip about events before Masri went to work for the network. He talked of Senator Howard Baker meeting with the organization's men in Europe, and how then Secretary of State Cyrus Vance had made a secret trip to Pakistan in advance of Carter's later public visit. Vance and later Carter had been hosted by BCCI's protocol department rather than Pakistani officials, which Masri thought a good joke. The quote-unquote contributions to politicians Sammy had heard about all took place in the Carter era. How strange, Beatty thought. Ali Mirza, who was a great deal more specific on how the bank bought influence in the United States, had also talked only about Carter-era politicians. Mirza had also talked about loans to Andrew Young, cash to Jesse Jackson, contributions to Carter, and of course about loans and money to Bert Lance, and the $1 million provided to influence the Georgia legislature to pass that banking bill. It was as if Abedi had given up trying to buy influence after Ronald Reagan was elected. But that hardly made sense. Yeah, the Reagan administration was awash in officials who cut corners, and many of them had gotten nailed for it. So all of these informants, weirdly, would just be like, yeah, it's so corrupt. All these Carter officials were getting bribed. Like, we owned President Carter. Meanwhile, like, we know the Reagan administration was up to their eyeballs in all of this, and like really were a whole order of magnitude worse. But there were all these people who were like, I mean, obviously it was like planned that eventually BCCI would go down.
It would
as
go
part
down.
Of this. Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating because it reminds me kind of like Epstein discourse, where people try to like, even though Epstein was clearly like swimming among like both parties, they are insistent that like, oh, he like it was all Clinton people, or it was all Trump people. And there's it's like, oh yeah, BCCI, its operations just like ceased because there was a new sheriff in town and he didn't agree that these Arabs, are you fucking kidding me? Like, like come on.
Yeah.
It's obviously not the case, but maybe that's a kind of thing where that's like a limited hangout. Also like shit code Carter.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he's like shit coded enough, he shit coded himself enough already. But I mean, when you look at like the movers in Carter's administration, like putting him aside, he's almost like a President Jimmy Zelensky. Like he was like a great face to put out there, like the humble peanut farmer, who wears a sweater and blah blah blah. And but if you look like Zbigniew Brzezinski, Bert Lance, like these guys, and basically he had backing from like the Trilateral Commission and the Rockefellers, even though like Nelson Rockefeller had been the president, the vice president in the previous administration. But I see that more as the Rockefellers were like covering both sides of the bets, and it's like, all right, we can either get Ford again, who's our guy, or we can get in this like fresh-faced little farm boy who is mostly amenable to being like steered in the directions we want as well. And then Reagan, I mean, like, I wish I knew more about like the Rockefellers, because they seem so prominently meddling in politics in the 70s. And then maybe it's because Nelson Rockefeller dies before 1980, but like David Rockefeller's attitude towards Reagan seems like it must have been supportive in a broad sense, right? I don't think there was like a conflict between like David Rockefeller or really, I guess you could say that like they got their man in the White House again in the form of George Bush. And once again, you had like Ronald Zelensky be the president and mysteriously almost got assassinated like right away, and then was like half senile for most of his term, et cetera, et cetera. So they pretty much were in effective control. And, you had people like Alexander Haig in the Reagan administration who were partying. The False Prophets book says that when the branch manager, the Miami branch of BCCI, threw a big gala like mansion party, a couple of the people were Alexander Haig, so he was tight with BCCI. And then also Jeb Bush was there, and perhaps most hilariously, for maybe what we'll get into later, future Senator Bob Graham, the guy who, now known as the guy who wants to get like the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission released, but before that was the guy who was meeting with the head of the ISI on the morning of 9/11. And with Porter Goss, who was like a lifelong CIA WASP, who became the CIA director under George W.
Yeah,
we'll get into that.
That's another one.
In a bit, but
that's another one of the like hobby horses of Abidullah Jan, is like the sort of idea that the ISI is like now being set up for like a similar like entrapment type scheme. Which, I mean, it's interesting because like, he doesn't necessarily make this connection, but like throughout these books, like a lot of the sort of like quote unquote whistleblowers, like, or people talking about the rumors inside BCCI. They'll say like, BCCI and the Pakistani intelligence are the same, like they're the same thing, which, it's interesting to think,
I think
that
that's
ISI
to some
being
extent
cultivated.
true.
Yeah. Like it's believable.
Yeah. Also False Prophets also did mention some of that kind of like Epstein shit about like boys from Lahore, like dancing boys.
Yeah,
I mean, didn't that even come out during like the Stratfor leaks? They were talking like all these military contractors were talking about getting dancing boys like in Afghanistan for like VIPs or something. I there's just a little part here. Yeah. They wrote that Abedi, apparently this is like a practice of Abedi's. I mean, grain of salt, I guess, but they said Abedi honed his approach in Pakistan during his days at United Bank when he courted Arab VIPs. One way he earned goodwill was by procuring sexual companions for them. When Sheikh Zayed visited Pakistan, Abedi would provide young Pakistani girls to members of the ruler's entourage. A Pakistani woman named Begum Ashgari Rahim was in charge of the prostitution operation, according to former associates of Abedi's. Rahim recruited these, quote, dancing girls, as they are called in Pakistan, by going to poor villages and making payments to their families. The girls were typically between 16 and 20 years old, but some were even younger. A few had not reached puberty. Rahim would purchase fine clothes and jewelry for them and teach them how to behave as sexual companions for Arab sheiks. Abedi procured boys as well as girls. One prominent member of a UAE ruling family is widely reputed to be a homosexual with a penchant for underage males. Quote, so BCCI brought boys from Peshawar, says a former bank official. And Abedi's involvement was so widely known that some Pakistanis used to refer to him as, quote, the great pimp. So, I mean, God, the overlap between like child pimping and like shady international finance, like does all like, is this a central component of like international finance that you know,
Yeah.
is it's super
Yeah, Outlaw
gross,
Bank
but
brings up the same thing. Like, yeah, I mean, I don't know, like it's murky. It's definitely possible though.
well,
Like,
here's something I'd throw out for clarification. The book only talks about him doing that for Arab sheikhs, because of course,
right,
there's
yeah,
pervy
Outlaw
Arab
Bank's the
princes.
same things that he
and
was like personally chased, but he, you know, provided them like whatever they wanted.
But what about all these Americans that are being approached? What about them?
Yeah.
Are any of them being offered something? Is
Well, that
there
was kind of
perhaps
the thing that,
opportunities
like-
for blackmail happening?
Well, that guy just said the same thing about Tower, right? John Tower, that he, you know, there were videos of him with girls from Lahore, you know.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah. Mhm.
I wrote a few notes on John Tower because, of course, he was, I believe, he chaired the Tower Commission into Iran-Contra and, you know, tragically didn't get to the bottom of it because, you know, he failed to indict his good friend George Bush. And didn't he die in like a plane crash eventually? He did.
Yeah.
John Tower. Yeah. Okay. So he was allegedly, who said that he was
Atlantic
caught?
Southeast Airlines flight to 2311. Passengers NASA astronaut Sonny Carter and John Tower. Interesting.
Damn.
Crash in the Georgia countryside.
Georgia. I mean, really, Georgia is a nexus point, you know, even when you're talking about Gay Pharaoh, the wealthy construction magnate in Saudi Arabia, you know, one of two construction magnate families that would have a big impact on America in the end of the 20th century. But he basically like set up shop in Georgia during the Carter years and became like this like Gatsby figure. And he was heavily involved in all kinds of BCCI stuff. And then later Iran-Contra, and was investing lots of money into Georgia and everything. So I don't know about that. But yeah, John Tower. So who was saying that he was caught on video?
It was one of like
blackmailed?
Beatty's informants, the same guy, Mirza, who was saying that Carter, you know, had been bribed, and that John Tower, we had him on tape. You know, he was just kind of relaying the rumors within BCCI about, you know, who had been influenced in the United States, and they mentioned that John Tower, you know, girls from Lahore had been brought in, which, like, you know, could easily like be true. Like it's definitely like, again, like it's not like substantiated like in the way that like some of these allegations and things are, but it definitely could be true. But like, you know, again, like it gets into the issue of like, is this something that is like unique to BCCI? No. Like, or for instance, is the existence of the BCCI why this is happening? Like, no. Like they have their own like corrupt pimp banks, and like like in prostitution still and sex trafficking still happens in Pakistan and in South Asia and Afghanistan in general. But you know, now they don't have a bank. Like and the sex trafficking still happens around like all of these like influence ops and banks, like, and it's allowed to happen in the West.
Well, clearly it was going on during the Afghan war, you know, and like 30 years later. So but yeah, no more bank, and and all these guys, who knows how many sickos are involved. Yeah, Senator Bob Graham said as he left the party at Abdur Sakia's house, he was the manager of the BCCI Miami branch.
Right, yeah. He was one of the eventual like whistleblowers, right?
Abdur Sakia?
Yeah, I think so, right?
I guess so.
I'm thinking of somebody else.
Maybe. But in 1981, he threw a lavish party in the penthouse of Miami's Interterra building. Lots of celebrities attended, including Andrew Young, Jeb Bush, and Bob Graham, the Democratic governor and now senator. As he left the party, Graham said, quote, "These banks are making a great statement about South Florida. They were attracted here because of our growth, our ebullience, and our confidence in the future." I think it might be the cocaine more that you know, drew them to South Florida in the early 80s. So that also around this time is like they were trying to get control of like an American bank to get like a foothold, right? In the US.
The idea, yeah.
And there was a big fight over it. Like, I mean, regulators were kind of like slowing them down. Jackson Stevens is getting involved. And like, I think Jackson Stevens is somebody who is like the main subject of one of Mark Lombardi's drawings, right? He's in the title. It's like George W. Bush, Jackson Stevens, like blah, 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 or something like that. I'm pretty sure that's true. And Jackson Stevens also,
Bill
even
Clinton,
though
the Lippo Group, and Jackson Stevens.
That's right. Yeah, because even though like this is a weird the funny pattern with like Bill Clinton is that even though he's a Democrat and Jackson Stevens was like a super far right Republican, he basically bankrolled Bill Clinton's entire political career up through 1992 into the presidency. And they had this like strange like buddy relationship. And at the same time, Jackson Stevens is like involved in, he's caught up in all this like BCCI shit, and also with like Bert Lance. So like the shady Dixie Democrat wing, he seems to like kind of have wrapped around his finger. Yeah, so I guess Abedi met Lance in Washington D.C. and they got along very famously. This is after Lance was like had to resign. They had a strong mutual attraction. False Prophet says. Lance wanted to get out of his financial mess by selling his National Bank of Georgia stock and refinancing his debts. Abedi wanted to expand into the U.S. Perhaps even more important to Abedi was the chance to use Lance as a bridge to the American political world. Shortly after the meeting in Washington, Abedi hired Lance as a business consultant to spot investment opportunities for BCCI. So Lance, I guess unsurprisingly, recommended an ailing bank that was the target of a great deal of regulatory scrutiny, the National Bank of Georgia, his bank, basically. NBG's woes did not seem to bother Abedi, and he was soon involved in serious discussions with Lance and his investment banker friend, Jackson Stevens. Despite Abedi's enthusiasm, there was little chance that a takeover by BCCI would be approved by U.S. bank regulators, but Abedi quickly found a solution. He arranged for NBG to be purchased by Gaith Rashad Faraone, a Saudi Arabian tycoon and BCCI client who was reputed to be one of the richest men in the world. So, okay, Gaith Faraone for a second. Interesting guy to focus on. When Faraone appeared in the American scene in the 70s, the only other well-known Saudi businessman was Adnan Khashoggi, the flamboyant arms dealer who had been implicated in the Lockheed bribery scandal a few years earlier and would figure in the Iran-Contra affair of the 80s. In his well-tailored suits and Van Dyke beard, Faraone appeared to be less vulgar than Khashoggi. Faraone's aides pointed out discreetly that their boss had a PhD from the Harvard Business School, a not very subtle reminder that Khashoggi was a college dropout. Faraone's Harvard degree was actually an MBA, but few people bothered to check. Former associates explained that Faraone favored the title doctor because it was used by men like Henry Kissinger and Armand Hammer, although they, of course, had earned their degrees. He liked to show off his art collection, which I guess was fraudulent, but he claimed it was like priceless. He owed a great deal to friends in high places. His father, like Khashoggi's, had been a personal physician and top advisor to the late King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. Faraone's flagship company, Saudi Research and Development Corporation, had been launched in 1966 in partnership with two of King Faisal's sons, Prince Abdullah and Prince Mohammed. Faraone later brought them out. Over the years, Faraone made a fortune by acting as a middleman on behalf of foreign companies doing business in Saudi Arabia, and he eventually emerged as one of Abedi's closest associates, serving as a bridge to other important Saudis, including his partner in the Jeddah hotel project, Kamal Adam, who is a brother-in-law of King Faisal's, as well as the head of Saudi Arabia's intelligence agency. Several of these Saudi contacts became BCCI shareholders, enhancing the credibility of the bank. Faraone invested in it. For a time, he was one of the biggest single shareholders, as did Adham and Adham's nephew, Prince Turki bin Faisal Al Saud. Considered the brightest of King Faisal's 7 sons, Prince Turki became Deputy Director General of Intelligence in 1973 at the age of 26. He succeeded Adham as the country's intelligence chief in 1977. Now, that's a big name right there. Prince Turki bin Faisal, right?
Mm-hmm.
He pops up all over the fucking place. He was the long-sitting intelligence chief of Saudi Arabia. And didn't he resign like right before 9/11 or something like that? Like either right before or right after? Let me just double check that. But it was probably like him and Prince Bandar bin Sultan were definitely the two most prominent Saudi princes to have like really deep American connections.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he resigned. He resigned his position on September 1st, 2001. September 1st. And also, I remember speaking of Adnan Khashoggi, not Khashoggi, as like CNN started saying post 2018. His nephew, Adnan Khashoggi's nephew, the martyr journalist Jamal Khashoggi, used to work for Prince Turki. and they were like close friends. So I'm willing to bet that like, given who his uncle and his like sort of mentor was, that Jamal Khashoggi wasn't just like a blogger who got like chopped to pieces because he like talked about how women can't drive or something like that. You know what I'm saying? But
I guess
I think
the Khashoggi's real name has a qaf. So actually, we say Khashoggi probably for ease when really it is Khashoggi. Well, like it's like Khalid, you know. It's like
I mean, I
really
get
like
it.
K.
I get
K
it.
is more like Kareem.
I get it, but also like fuck the media for doing that, because like I know what they were up to. It's just like changing. Honestly, it's just like changing all the Ukraine shit to be like Kyiv, or like, oh, Zelensky has 2 Y's, or like we're gonna spell Kolomoisky's name differently now, so that like all the SEO gets fucked up. But in this, it's more like an audio SEO where like maybe somebody's memory would be jogged if you heard that name Khashoggi, which is pretty specific, you know, on the news like 24/7 for like 6 months straight. But the fact is that like that. I think that was an op, because nobody brought up like Trump's friendship with Adnan Khashoggi the entire time. Like everyone just pretended that never happened. And it's like, and so the people that allegedly hate Trump the most, you know, and would find any reason to like, you know, basically tar him or call him corrupt. It's like, remember when you bought Adnan Khashoggi's yacht and went on David Letterman in 1987 and talked about like what a cool guy he is? You know, like right when you were buying Resorts International and all that shit, you know, come on, dog. Like, nobody brought that up. So I think what I'm gonna stick to saying Khashoggi, even though it's like wrong, because lest we forget the connection.
Yeah, well, I guess if they talked about Jamal Khashoggi, one would expect Khashoggi. I mean, it is very hard to pronounce in English. It's one of the harder. You know, you don't usually see those 2 consonants back to back a lot of the time.
No, you don't.
Is that even an Arab name? I guess it
No,
must
it's
be,
Turkish.
But... Oh, that makes sense.
Because
no
his father was the doctor of King Ibn Saud.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And that's why he had such a privileged position, much like Pharaoh's, or I think it was Pharaoh's family. And then the Adham, the intelligence chief, who's another person that was like suspected to have huge CIA ties. And he got very like involved in sort of BCCI and like American investment type stuff. And this guy's like a former intelligence chief of Saudi Arabia that everyone just kind of pretended like, no, he's just like a private businessman now. Like, what's the big deal? You know, but I think it once again goes to show that maybe especially when the inroads to like the Saudis were really established in like the late 70s, that's where like the U.S. intelligence links also really kicked up, right? Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think something worth kind of mentioning, like kind of that I think is sort of relative to this. I mean, there's this interesting article, again, from WAPO, like around the time, that sort of talks about an interesting aspect of this. I mean, I guess it's talking about 1984. They're talking about 1984, but, you know, it's an interesting aspect where like the CIA had made a report on BCCI that had been like ignored. So there's kind of like this interesting back and forth between like the regulatory authorities and the CIA about like who dropped the ball. And, you know, the CIA pointing to this memo that they had written. And I think this brings up like one of the linchpins around this whole thing, which to me doesn't quite add up, but is like repeated and upheld by everyone. Like, you know, whether they're like critical of what happened or if they're just going along with the mainstream narrative, like it's a very weird thing. So they write, the placement of a quotation in a September 6th article on the BCCI affair made it appear as if Robert J. Stanky, this is a correction I guess they issued, a former Treasury Department official, was commenting on the entire contents of a 1986 CIA report when he said the report's allegations were too sketchy to act on. Stanky's comments pertained only to the report's brief references to BCCI's alleged money laundering activities and not to assertions that BCCI had gained control of Washington's first American bank shares, published 9/21/91. So they retracted an aspect of this that you'll hear. But anyway, so the article proper goes, if the Bank of Credit and Commerce International scandal took official Washington by surprise this summer, the U.S. government has mostly itself to blame. This article is from 1991. As early as 1984, federal agencies received warning signals that the unorthodox overseas bank was laundering drug money and had illegally acquired control of a DC bank that federal regulators had sought to keep out of BCCI's hands. But no enforcement action took place until 1988, and it did not expose the pervasive fraud that regulators now allege. BCCI continued to operate in the United States until regulators here and abroad seized most of the bank's operations on July 5th, the beneficiary of bureaucratic tunnel vision, some officials' ignorance of American banking laws, and a widespread failure to make full use of information already at the government's disposal, according to current and former government officials. As one of history's biggest banking scandals broke this summer, some media reports focus on the Central Intelligence Agency, suggesting that it knew of BCCI's illegal activities but ignored them so that it could continue collecting intelligence from inside the bank. But
heard that one before.
A reconstruction of events based on more than 50 interviews shows that the CIA passed along to several other agencies key intelligence information about BCCI, though it did fail to reach one key regulatory agency. The agencies that got the information did not react aggressively, and the reports did not reach all the offices that would have been interested. So the CIA tried to warn everyone, but they just didn't listen. So in the meantime, law enforcement officials around the country were picking up evidence of BCCI's illegal activities in isolated criminal cases, but they did not recognize that the incidents reflected a wider pattern. And this is the key part that doesn't add up at all. Only by happenstance, in fact, did BCCI become ensnared in a U.S. Customs Service investigation in Tampa that led to a 1988 indictment of the bank on money laundering charges. Terrible, said former Commissioner of Customs William Von Raab, grading the government's overall performance on BCCI. The system worked in the worst possible way. So this is like what happened according to them, according to the CIA, that is. Several times during the interview, this official had said the CIA information had been handled by the Treasury during the first Reagan term. Reagan's second term began on January 20th, 1985. Baker was confirmed as Treasury Secretary on January 29th, 1985, so he ignored information. This official said that he spoke with Mulholland about what happened to the CIA report, and Mulholland told him he sent it on to the office of the Comptroller of the Currency. He named the man that Mulholland said had received the report. That man, however, said in an interview did not recall seeing any report about BCCI. Former Comptroller C. Todd Conover, who left in May 1985, said he did not recall seeing anything on BCCI. Neither did his successor, Robert L. Clark, a spokesman said. One official, commenting about everyone's reluctance to acknowledge handling the CIA report, said, "It's like the commercial for the breakfast cereal. Give it to him, give it to him, give it to him, Mickey." Or give it to Mickey. I don't know what that even means. But anyway, I guess they were passing it around, like not wanting to acknowledge it is the idea. But so anyway, several months after the 1986 CIA report, I don't know, I've dyscalculated apparently now, a stroke of bad luck brought our customs agents inside BCCI's offices in Tampa and made BCCI a top priority of U.S. criminal investigators. So this is a stroke of luck, according to them. The agent, Robert Mazur, had spent months posing as a money launderer. One of his customers, a Colombian drug trafficker, had suggested Mazur could launder more money if he opened an account in an international bank with a branch in Panama. In the early weeks of 1987, Mazur passed a big gold-lettered BCCI sign on a street in downtown Tampa and chose the bank. I drove by and just happened to see the sign. So that's how all of this unfolded, was allegedly
that's
this
how
guy
they
just
got caught.
Yeah, this guy happened to see the sign. So that's something.
I bet they have like operations in Panama. Like,
yeah, well, they are an international bank. It does say international on the sign.
Bullshit.
So,
call bullshit. That's
so,
not
yeah,
believable
like
for a
conveniently
second.
right at the turning point when, in the early 1980s, when it was about time to like wrap things up with BCCI.
Particularly the late 80s when the Iran-Contra thing had just been exposed. Because didn't Operation Sea Chase really start kicking off around like 87?
Yeah, that's when it kind of happens. It was in 1986 that, they started the scheme based in the Tampa office of BCCI.
So around the time it like really blew up and like went public when that plane got shot down. But before that, I think, and I maybe you could say by like the end of 1986, like Gorbachev was in. Who knows if there's any tie-ins with that? But the tide was turning in this Cold War confrontation, and the Afghanistan operation was kind of had a momentum of its own. So maybe it was time just to place that. So like when when Reagan and Casey and everybody get in, well, right before that even, right, like I think was it 1978, General Zia takes over in Pakistan, right, in a coup.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, like Washington did kind of its like abusive patron kind of posture in like that it suspended aid to Islamabad in 1979, partially because of the nuclear weapons program. But then after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Carter turned the spigot back on, and the Reagan administration was even more generous, seeking a chance to fight the Soviet evil empire by aiding Pakistan as well as the Mujahideen rebels in Afghanistan. And all this would be
he was like
through the Zia regime.
like Zelensky in a way because they like didn't like him, but then
But then the Russian bear roared.
Exactly.
And they had to rush to his side. So, and they had to fund all these, the fanatical death squads. But then, so then together with the Pakistani government, or actually one source said that that many times when the aid package was approved of in the Congress, Abedi would take credit with General Zia, who added that the BCCI chief helped the Pakistani foreign minister arrange meetings with U.S. officials. So he was very involved in this. But, the book does point out that even though the Afghan operation, got way less attention than the Contra War, they basically did receive like more than $2 billion. And of course, I think we've discussed before, it's been described as America's biggest covert action program since World War II. The war in Afghanistan led to an extraordinary 10-year partnership between the Pakistani military, its intelligence agency, the ISI, the Saudi intelligence agency, and the CIA. Zia built the ISI into his chosen covert operations unit. Working with the ISI, Prince Turki bin Faisal, the Saudi intelligence chief and a BCCI shareholder, distributed more than $1 billion in cash to Afghan guerrillas during the late 1980s. Abedi and several of his close associates were conduits for information and intelligence. In addition, BCCI handled transfers of funds through its Pakistani branches and acted as a collection agency for war materiel and even for the Mujahideen's pack animals, according to internal documents. BCCI was also extremely useful when the CIA, the National Security Council, or other agencies wanted to supply arms discreetly to allies, like the Mujahideen. The Afghan operation was so extensive that the CIA station in Islamabad was one of the biggest in the world, according to Bob Woodward. He added the CIA's William Casey, quote, had the closest relationship with Zia of any member of the Reagan administration. Casey also became close to one of Zia's top advisors, Agha Hasan Abedi. Abedi helped arrange Casey's sojourns in Islamabad and met with the CIA director during visits to Washington, according to former BCCI officials and sources in Washington. Typically, Abedi would stay at a luxury hotel, and Casey would go to his suite. The two men, who met intermittently over a 3-year period, would spend hours talking about the war in Afghanistan, the Iran-Contra arms trades, Pakistani politics, and the situation in the Persian Gulf. Casey was quick to realize that Abedi and his network could be useful to U.S. intelligence around the world, whereas men like Adham and Prince Turki were primarily of value in the Middle East. Quote, what Abedi had in his hand was magic, something Kamal Adham or even Prince Turki didn't have, said a former BCCI official. Abedi had branches and banks in at least 50 third-world countries. The BCCI people in all these countries were on a first-name basis with the prime ministers, presidents, finance ministers, and elite in those countries, and their wives and mistresses. Casey could ask Abedi whether a country's leader had, quote, a girlfriend or a foreign currency account, the BCCI official continued. Abedi could say, we'll tell you how much he's salted abroad and how much money he gives to his girlfriend. The BCCI network was also valuable as a mechanism for exerting influence abroad, thanks to the political connections Abedi and his minions had made over the years. The bank's network could also serve as a discrete channel for financial operations, including bribes, money laundering, and the financing of arms deals. As Abedi's relationship with Casey blossomed, BCCI became increasingly important to the CIA. The agency opened several accounts at BCCI, as well as at its satellite in the capital, First American. The CIA used more than 40 accounts at First American for routine business. I mean, throughout his tenure at the CIA, Casey bristled at Congress's attempts to impose controls on covert operations. We talked about this in our Contra 5 victory, mostly around Central America. So in an effort to circumvent Congress, Casey, together with NSC officials, cooked up a secret plan that Oliver North, a Marine colonel and NSC aide, later called, quote, a neat idea. BCCI was intimately involved, And that's where, the Iran-Contra enterprise basically came out of. So, BCCI was very critical to like everything Bill Casey was doing in his like covert victory ops, throughout the 1980s, like jetting around the world and getting this big alliance to flood Afghanistan with guns and chaos and launder a shitload of money. I mean, so it got wrapped up in all that stuff, and then it's in the late 80s when things are starting to get exposed, and also Casey dies I believe it was 87, right before he's supposed to testify. He had a big stroke and then he dies. And
interesting. That weirdly happened to a lot of people involved in this.
It really did.
Abedi himself had a heart attack mysteriously, and then just stayed in Pakistan after that and died not too long after.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I think
conspicuous.
Very conspicuous. And of course, apparently, I actually didn't realize this. I don't know if this is miswritten. I forget which of these books mentioned it, but it mentioned that the executive assistant of Bill Casey during Iran-Contra was Robert Gates, who would go on to basically be I think he almost became director of the CIA. He was nominated in early 1987 after Casey died, but he withdrew his name after it became clear the Senate would reject the nomination due to controversy about his role in Iran-Contra. And then when Bush got into the White House, he nominated him again, and then it was confirmed by the Senate. And, Robert Gates, the guy who was even George W. Bush and Obama's Secretary of Defense, right? But apparently he was at Bill. He was the guy who probably had the most connections to Bill Casey and knew where the bodies were buried.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And he never I remember when Obama kept him, everyone's like, wow, what a team of rivals. He's so responsible. You know what I mean? Nobody was bringing up wait, this is one of the fucking Iran-Contra kingpins almost. A guy who was all up in there, probably just as much as Oliver North and everything. And it's interesting to watch what he ends up advocating for later down the road post Iran-Contra. But anyways,
the official line from the CIA, given in testimony before a Senate subcommittee last year by then acting CIA Director Richard Kerr, was that the CIA did not make great use of BCCI.
BCCI was not a major banking mechanism used by the agency for the support of covert foreign intelligence operations. It was used on an extremely limited basis for legal banking transactions.
But an investigation by NBC News over the last 5 months, including interviews with former BCCI insiders, prosecutors, and foreign intelligence sources, has found that there is much, much more to the relationship between BCCI and the CIA than anyone in government has been willing to admit.
An important part of the CIA-BCCI intrigue involves what BCCI sources say were secret meetings here at the Madison Hotel in Washington, in one of the $2,000 a night presidential suites on the top floor of the hotel. According to BCCI sources, it was here that the head of the bank, Agha Hasan Abedi, met secretly for at least 3 years with CIA Director Casey. Sources say the secret meetings took place every few months, and the agenda involved Casey's 2 most important covert projects, secret Iran-Contra arms shipments and the army of the Afghan rebels.
BCCI became an off-the-book operation of the CIA all around the world.
The CIA told us it could not find any records in its files of a Casey connection to BCCI, but our sources say that's not surprising. Very few knew what Casey was up to with BCCI.
Officials at the White House knew that BCCI was involved in a wide range of criminal activity as early as 1981. But what the White House knew was considered top secret, and no one has been willing to talk about it until now.
Very early on in 1981, after I joined the staff of the National Security Council, I began to see the name of BCCI on a number of different documents.
Norman Bailey was a senior intelligence analyst in the Reagan White House.
several.
And in an interview with Mark Hosenball of NBC News, Bailey laid out some of what he says the White House knew BCCI was doing.
Terrorist activities, gun running, guerrilla movements, technology transfer violations, embargo and boycott violations, things of that kind. When these documents are unclassified or released, the involvement of BCCI and all these activities will be reinforced. It was quite a record.
But what Bailey didn't know at the time was that the director of the CIA, William Casey, had his own secret BCCI agenda, using the corrupt bank for covert activities. Bailey now says that explains why others at the White House were in no hurry to go after BCCI.
It's public knowledge now that the Central Intelligence Agency used the BCCI for certain of its payments. And obviously doing that would make them less than totally favorable to blowing the BCCI cover. And the question that comes up again and again is why did the Justice Department appear to be dragging its feet in investigating BCCI? With us in Washington now is Assistant Attorney General Robert Mueller. Mr. Mueller, can you answer this question so many viewers must have? Why the long delay?
Well, let me start off by putting this in context, if I could, from the perspective of United States law enforcement. We were the first entity around the world to bring a prosecution against BCCI, and that is the result of the wedding which you saw, which led to the prosecution in 1988. And the strategy then, because BCCI was not a United States bank, was to convict the individuals, the high-level managers that we had indicted in Florida, and get them to agree to cooperate, give them an incentive to cooperate.
You were going after the the drug launderers, in effect.
We were going after the drug launderers, and but the way you open up something like BCCI is to get those individuals who had some familiarity with the inner workings to cooperate and cooperate truthfully.
Yes, but sir,
we were successful in doing that. And
but some of your own agents who were working as undercover agents have testified before Congress that they wanted to go beyond the drug launderers, but they couldn't get to first base with the Justice Department. That
is not their testimony. That is not their testimony at all. And what we did, and let me go back to the segment that you showed of Shinoy. Nazir Shinoy is one of those persons whom you showed on an earlier segment as an individual had information as to BCCI. He's in those red robes because he was prosecuted by the Justice Department and has agreed to cooperate. And the evidence relating to the acquisition of United States banks came as a result, in large part, of the cooperation resulting from our prosecutions in 1988.
But, sir, we have heard again from other people, including those who work at the White House and the National Security Council, we know about the CIA information, that there was an awareness, there was knowledge that something wrong was being done, which comes back to the question which you really haven't answered in this specific way. Why was there this delay of several years, certainly and including after 1988, until 1990-91, before real steps were taken against the principals, including
I think anybody who believes that there was delay attributable to something else and does not understand how our process works is naive. In a case of a complicated investigation such as this, where the records and the testimony is generally overseas, it takes a long while to break an individual to have them cooperate and cooperate truthfully. And in this case, there was a concurrence of events that enabled us in 1990 and 1991 to bring the prosecutions we have had.
So do you want to talk about the downfall of BCCI, this kind of possible controlled demo operation, Sea Chase?
Yeah. Sea Chase, that is like really what Abidullah Jan's argument pivots around, is like the susness of Sea Chase. So just to like go back through the timeline that's sort of laid out, like even in that WAPO article about it, he says like, it talks about like, who knew what then? And it weirdly all does kind of start like around, like the early 80s is the earliest. In the early 80s, the National Security Council claims that they saw intelligence reports that BCCI is involved in illegal transfers of sensitive technology, embargo violations, and financing of guerrilla movements, according to a former NSC official. So that's the first kind of account of like, anyone. That's the first time there's any kind of like percolation of any of this, although it's kind of retroactive, like that, no one really knows about this. It's just like someone recalling that they've heard about it. So it's starting to kind of bubble up. That's the earliest. And then in the like much later in the 80s, there's kind of like a little bit of activity, about BCCI prior to that. Like the IRS was contacted by a former BCCI courier who tells of possible illegal activities, including large amounts of cash being flown in and out of the U.S. An IRS officer recommends targeting BCCI with an undercover operation, but officials refuse her requests in 1984. So then in part at the request of other agencies, the CIA begins focusing on BCCI and its efforts to learn more about the money laundering by drug dealers and terrorists. So then, like coincidentally, apparently, according to this article itself and to pretty much everyone who's reported on this, that guy, Robert Mazur, like who's in the process of a sting operation on a, South American drug cartel, happens to choose BCCI as, the bank that he'll work with.
By the way, just to pinpoint the date exactly, I'm seeing here from BCCI to ISI, he says that on February 11th, 1987, that was the day when Mazur walked into the BCCI Tampa office. So that would have been after the public. I think it was October 86 when Eugene Hasenfus was shot down in Nicaragua, and it like properly blew up. So we're talking about like maybe like 4 or 5 months after Iran-Contra is made public, and the scandals really, I forget exactly when Casey died, actually. Hold on, let me just like look at the Bill Casey death. He died in May of 87, but I forget when he had the stroke. But like this is, like 3 months before Bill Casey dies, this thing gets started. Okay, go on.
So, yeah. And then he just, that was the day when he happened to walk into that office in the Riverside Plaza building. So Jean says, on April 7th, 1987, Mazur met Mora, who is, one of the people who he's trying to implicate in all of this, part of his sort of sting operation. Like not his sting operation on BCCI that's, kind of being speculated by Jean, but just like, what he did admit he was doing, which is, related to money laundering and drug dealing. So he met Mora and told him bluntly that in the future, business would be routed through BCCI in Panama, which would eventually increase the profits. Mazur bragged at the stage at the entrapment process that he had been doing business with at the stage of the entrapment process that he had been doing business with BCCI, quote unquote, for a long time, and exaggerated his relationship with it, claiming that previously the bank had opened an account for him all over the world. Mora listened and accepted the offer, since his earnings had already increased tenfold without much effort. However, he suggested opening the account with a Swiss bank rather than the BCCI, but Mazur was adamant about his proposal. This suggests that entrapment of the BCCI was planned from the beginning and it was no accidental choice, as Mazur had claimed. At a lunch on April 8th, 1987, Agent Mazur introduced Mora to Argudo, manager of the BCCI, and talked of the Latin American branch, Tampa branch, and talked at length about money laundering. Agent Abreu described the occasion as one of a social nature. This is at odds with previous meetings between Mazur and Mora. However, it is important to note that, unlike in the case of other defendants with whom all meetings were duly taped, the U.S. government claimed not to have taped these meetings with Argudo, U.S. citizen, or David Miller, BCCI employee and U.S. citizen. This suggests the possibility these two employees of the BCCI may have worked for the U.S. government as inside sources in roles similar to that of Rita Rosansky at the Florida National Bank. Additionally, in 1987, midway through Operation Sea Chase, both Argudo and Miller left the BCCI and transferred to new jobs with other American banks. Even though they were involved in the conspiracy as much as other employees of the BCCI, neither of them was indicted nor charged for what they allegedly said or did. This is a further indication that they may have had an ongoing working relationship with the U.S. government. Mazur wanted another piece in place. He contacted a Panama City lawyer, Miguel Sanchez, and created another fake Panamanian company, IDC International. Coupled with his new relationship with the BCCI, the company would put him in a position to move funds offshore directly. On August 13th, 1987, David Miller helped Mazur in opening an IDC operational account in Panama. No funds from legal proceeds have been wired through the BCCI as yet, nor had this been proposed to any BCCI employee. So, I mean, not to say like this guy is very like partial to like the BCCI, like as like, you know, not necessarily being tainted by the stuff prior to Sea Chase. I'm sure that like they were like all like, you know, I mean, he does kind of acknowledge that there were like issues like in the management structure or whatever, but he doesn't like, you know, or that there even was some corruption. But, you know, I think that there's probably something, I think as we talked about like, you know, a little bit earlier, like there's probably a middle ground between like Outlaw Bank and their perspective, you know, the perspective of the author of Beatty, and this perspective, which is like, you know, very positive towards BCCI. But, you know, I think that the basic thesis of the idea of the entrapment does kind of hold up, or the idea that it was kind of utilized up to a point and then, controlled demos, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it is interesting how like a lot of the stuff that like these the prosecution was ultimately based on was like kind of stuff that this guy like, you know, he recorded, or like, you know, like just little statements that people made. Like even the whole idea of like the ownership of First American by BCCI, like a lot of the investigation that was done of that, like at the time anyway, didn't come up with like really anything conclusive. But it was because people said that they owned, like that you said that BCCI, like on tape, you know, and prior, like, you know, recorded conversations that BCCI owned First American, that, you know, this thing was alleged. But even, I think Mazer even at one point claimed to his, you know, clients that he owned part of BCCI. Like he claimed that like he owned part of the bank in order to kind of entice them to bank there. An interesting thing that like, you know, he would often talk about like Lee Iacocca and
Lee Iacocca.
Yeah. He would just constantly mention how he had clients, like basically to the people handling his accounts at BCCI. He would say like, you know, some of my clients, they're like Lee Iacocca with cars, except they deal with drugs. And like the people managing his accounts would be like, you know, it's not our responsibility, like what your clients do or whatever. You know, it kind of sounded a little bit like a James O'Keefe type thing. Like,
I was going to say this sounds like Project
whatever.
Veritas. Like,
yeah, exactly.
kind of
it was like a Project Veritas type thing where they're like, you know, well, we don't really care like what you do or so. And then that was like, got him.
Making
you know,
leading comments basically to be like, wow, I'm so glad you guys are like laundering all my drug money for me. And it's like, you know,
yeah, exactly. And it's like
kind of giving off major Fed vibes. That's exactly what he was. So
and acknowledge, like somehow like sort of like, you know, brushing that off or not immediately being like, sir, get out of this bank at once, like, you know, or something like that. That basically makes you totally legally liable, like under some law, like, you know, having knowledge of handling any kind of legal funds that's the end of you.
But you know, that's very like, that kind of is entrapment to a certain degree. Also, like every bank kind of looks the other way. I think, like you said earlier, like a lot of this behavior is like not so much unique to BCCI. In terms of looking the other way when wealthy clients show up with dubious amounts of money.
Yeah, or making these weird, like, offhand remarks, like, you know, what does that even mean? Like, is he telling the truth? Like, you know...
Well, I mean, he mentions as part of the operation, like, it says, on October 28th, 1987, for the first time, drug-derived funds were sent to the BCCI. Agent Abreu collected $750,000 from drug dealers in Detroit, and U.S. Customs aircraft flew the cash in 2 suitcases to Tampa, where it was deposited into the Florida National Bank. A corresponding amount was wired to IDC Panama for distribution by checks, without the BCCI's knowledge that the funds were illegal. But just like, wait, hold up. So an agent went and collected $750,000 from, quote, drug dealers in Detroit, and then U.S. Customs aircraft flew the cash to Tampa. Like, that's like a pretty good sum of money. It's not like they didn't pull it out of like an evidence locker and be like, all right, take this $750,000. He collected it from Detroit drug dealers. So like, did he do that as an undercover agent? In which case,
no, like they were making a ton of drug money that they pocketed. and used as part of this.
That's what I mean. I mean, he doesn't have footnotes in this book, but I do wonder, like, was that publicly announced?
No,
that's
he actually
what he
does.
Did?
He has endnotes, not footnotes, but endnotes. Yeah.
But I mean, that's like that sounds like one way or another, you're actually involved in the drug trade, but like it's ostensibly for this purpose of like framing other corrupt people, but like you're collecting profits from street gangs, basically, which is isn't that kind of the whole crux of like the Gary Webb Dark Alliance like idea of flooding the streets with crack cocaine in the 80s and using it to raise money for all kinds of other sketchy bullshit. I think even though this gets painted as like this badass undercover operation to catch a corrupt bank, like this feels more like it's just in line with, it's like a different branch of like the CIA bringing the cocaine in itself and then finding all kinds of uses for it. Because just as, there's one way to do it is like you illegally make money off of it, but then you can also like throw it on other people. Like when Reagan went on TV and said, like I caught the Sandinistas trafficking cocaine. It's like you can just project your crimes onto other entities and make it seem like it's all their fault and then control demo them. And then you're upholding law and order. You didn't do anything wrong. So yeah, this is a very curious investigation, basically.
Yeah. I mean, he sums it up well. Abdullah John does, I think, in the sort of final chapter of the book, which is titled "Time for Pakistani Generals to Tell the Truth," which is the best time where it weaves together the two aspects of this book, the two case studies, like the BCCI and the ISI, and how they're both kind of victims of this entrapment and the sort of 9/11 truth component that he brings in. He says, Operation 9/11 was a carefully planned intelligence operation, much like the smaller Operation Sea Chase to entrap the BCCI. The 9/11 hijackers were agents and double agents and probably unaware of the scope of the operation. They, along with the ISI, were instruments of a carefully planned international intelligence operation, which was designed to entrap Osama bin Laden and allow for war on Afghanistan. The evidence confirms that the ISI was used as a local arm of the CIA in South Asia. After all, the ISI owes its existence to the CIA. Now that truth is becoming known, what lies ahead for the ISI in Pakistan will depend on when Washington feels the time is right to turn Pakistan into another Iraq and Afghanistan. The ISI's role in 9/11 has already forced Pakistan to pay a price in the form of permanent U.S. forces in Pakistan, and the agreement of continued provision of support to the U.S. war of aggression on Afghanistan. History shows that the U.S. government has previously attempted to use ISI crimes to press Pakistani governments into submission. The Washington Post published a report by John Ward and Kamran Khan in a September 12, 1994 edition in an attempt to implicate the Pakistani army in drug trafficking. The News published the same report in October 1994. Another attempt was made through Kamran Khan in the April 4, 1999 edition of the News. More recently, the ISI faced severe criticism at a U.S. Senate briefing on the drug trade, a crime in which the CIA has been involved since 1960. This hearing of the U.S. Senate was just another threat in the vast trap being laid for the Pakistani army for the next several years. And then this is the sort of part where he describes how the entrapment works in both cases. The entrapment process adopted by the U.S. agencies is very simple. They plan and commit a crime of serious magnitude. They achieve their strategic objective behind the crime. At the same time, they involve the victim in just a fraction of the overall criminal plan. The unknown, unintended cooperation in the crime is then later used to punish the victim. This is exactly how the BCCI was trapped. Irrefutable evidence, as discussed in the earlier sections of this book, demonstrates that the CIA funded the operation against the BCCI with drug money earned through the organized selling of drugs to its own employees. According to the court transcripts of the BCCI case, by late 1987, the agents had passed approximately $2.2 million derived from Don Chepe's proceeds through the IDC account and had split the 7 to 8% commission profit with Mora and Don Chepe's representative, Javier Ospina, without telling any BCCI officers about drugs. Yet it was the BCCI that paid the price. So again, he has sort of partisan bias towards the BCCI, which I'm sure was involved in like all sorts of sus shit, probably on par with a lot of banks. But I think that the general argument holds up. Like it's a two-pronged scheme where you use it as a vessel to commit a massive crime, and then they take the fall, and then you hit two birds with one stone.
Absolutely. I think you can see it with Manuel Noriega, as I'll get to in the near future. I think Charles Taylor fits into this category quite cleanly, as somebody who you get him to do dirty shit for you, and then you turn around and go, oh, what a brutal thug, warlord, evil, we have to overthrow you, kind of thing. Like they implicate you in it. And yeah, I'll just read from like page 25. He gives a very concise explanation of the specific plan in Operation Sea Chase, like what it really was doing in this instance. He says that with BCCI's aforementioned background as a rising third world institution, U.S. Customs, the CIA, and the FBI devised an elaborate plan titled Operation Sea Chase to topple the giant. An agent, Robert Mazur, also introduced as Robert Musella to the BCCI, spearheaded the operation. He was supported by confidential informers, including Alvaro Uribe. Also involved were money launderers Jimmy Mora and Gonzalo Mora from Medellin, Colombia. The plan was to enlarge the minor money laundering business of Gonzalo Mora through extensive logistical support from the U.S. government. Undercover agents would collect drug money in cash on the streets of the United States, launder them through major U.S. cooperating banks, and return the profit from the sale proceeds of the drugs to the owners in Colombia. The following evidence from court transcripts of BCCI officials indicted in the U.S. shows that once the efficiency and track record of the Mora organization was proven, this minor money laundering operation would rise to the big league and entice the kingpins of the drug trade to deal with Mora. This would ultimately allow the U.S. government to direct the money laundering operation toward BCCI, the primary target. So it's like they set up a whole fake like money laundering apparatus supported by the U.S. government and built up its credibility with these, these sort of cocaine, quote unquote, cartel kingpins in Colombia, right? Who set up their whole operation with like Nazi help and like Klaus Barbie and shit. But that's for another day. And then got all the flows of this drug money like flowing in a kind of through a set of, I guess, like entities that they controlled, and then take that and kind of steer it. Because then that not only becomes a successful way to launder your illegal covert ops money, but then it becomes a weapon that you can aim. Okay, we could take all this money and then we could aim it at a bank that we want to take out. In this case, BCCI, and then use it, and then it becomes all BCCI's fault, and everything else gets obscured that came before it. Like the U.S. built this entire infrastructure in the first place, and then went and like caught one person like cleaning some money with it, basically. Who it does sound like, well, they were involved in all kinds of like covert ops, in particular the kind of Iran-Contra cocaine money, which just seems like that's basically kind of what they got. Like that's essentially what they got caught for, right? At the end of the day in Sea Chase. It seems like maybe they were less directly involved in that, or less involved than this like entire operation would assert.
Yeah.
And it was the U.S. like pawning off their responsibility onto the scapegoat.
Right. I think they definitely I'm sure that it's not true that there was no corruption involved, because I mean, really, the Islamic prescription on usury is correct, and it's fundamentally corrupt to bank at all. So, it really does inevitably lead to it's definitely a gateway to a lot of corruption. And I'm sure, even
banking,
more so,
the original gateway drug.
Yeah, it is the original gateway drug. I mean, look what happened.
9/11.
So I'm sure that they were involved in a lot of corruption, but the way that it was spun as these for instance, I do want to go back to Outlaw Bank more extensively in a little bit, but there's towards the end of the book, he has this very sort of interesting part where let me see if I can just flip to it in a relatively quick way here on archive, if it's going to cooperate with me at all. Gonna have to refresh. All right. Seems to, I gotta borrow again. There we go. So at this point in the book, Beatty weaves this interesting sort of thought experiment where he talks about the idea of like agency X or whatever. So he says, the astonishing depth of the official knowledge would not become apparent until much later. Between 1979 and 1981, federal law enforcement agencies received more than 700 tips about the bank's criminal enterprises, according to Congressman Charles Schumer's final 1992 report for the House. Yeah.
I forgot that he was the one who did it. Yeah, him, John Kerry, and Daddy Mueller were the kind of the big people.
Taken together, Mueller lied. Yeah. Taken together, the tips covered almost all of BCCI's lines of business, from promoting political unrest in Pakistan to the smuggling of arms to Syria, Iran, and Libya, political unrest in Pakistan, to financing terrorist groups and organized crime in the United States and Italy. Concluded Schumer, at the very least, there is absolutely nobody putting together all the pieces. You could make a credible case that somebody told them not to do anything about BCCI. That somebody remains unnamed. William Casey had something to do with the immunity BCCI enjoyed, but Casey died in early 1987. General Zia had contributed to Abedi's immunity, but Zia was killed in August 1988 as the Soviets were preparing their retreat from Afghanistan. Abedi's usefulness as a hidden ally of American intelligence went away with the Soviet troops. And before the year ended, the charismatic Abedi himself dropped out of sight, sidelined by a heart attack. Again, like the interesting series of yeah, the mantle of protection that seemed to shield BCCI's American operations remained in place until the bank's rapidly dwindling assets made it impossible to paper over the frauds any longer. In this part, it was because I don't know if that's the causality quite right there, but anyway, in part, this is because BCCI, though it was virtually imploding after 1988, remained a necessary middleman in clandestine weapons deals and other foreign initiatives. BCCI wasn't finished in 1988, Condor said. They were the only way we could talk to certain folks, and they were the only vehicle available for some transactions. Who else could wire something together involving Saudi Arabia, China, Israel, and the US? So then he's saying, he goes on and says, to see how BCCI's links to the U.S. intelligence compromise law enforcement, one need only ask two questions. If an agency of the government, call it Agency X, had run a serious probe of BCCI at any given point in time, what would it have been likely to find? And what would have been the implications of making the findings public? In 1982, when BCCI took over the financial general after a 3-year struggle, Agency X would have found it intriguing that the CIA neglected to tell the banking regulators who some of the purchasers really were. Based on what was known, there were only two possibilities. Either one of the most influential banks in Washington had just fallen into the hands of foreign intelligence chieftains of Saudi Arabia, or an international bank of ill repute had been allowed to buy into the American banking system illegally over the objections of the Federal Reserve. Even a rudimentary background check on such shareholders as Kamal Adham and A.R. Khalil would have revealed those intelligence connections. Had investors from Agency X looked at BCCI in 1984 and 1985, they would have discovered the bank's burgeoning relationship with the CIA. Abedi had by then become an ally in William Casey's crusade against the evil empire. When Senator Paula Hawkins visited Pakistan in 1984 and upset apple carts by confronting General Zia with her knowledge about a Pakistani bank laundering drug money out of Miami and the Cayman Islands, both the State Department and the Justice Department intervened with dazzling speed. The reasons, in retrospect, are obvious. Had the senator been helped with her probe instead of being warned off, she might have uncovered the massive money laundering being run by BCCI through the Cayman's Miami money laundering being, she might have uncovered, through the Cayman's Miami Tampa nexus that was being run through there. That would have led her to Panama and Manuel Noriega, who happened to be on the CIA payroll at the time. But the Afghan civil war was heating up, and Abedi had bent U.S. foreign policy to his own ends. And it's
really? His own ends.
Yeah, he had bent U.S. foreign policy to his ends. Is incredible.
William Casey, that real William Casey erasure going on in that book.
Exactly. Like, all right, thank you.
Real world anti-communist league erasure.
Yes.
Speaking of that, like one of the people that was involved in BCCI, I think I mentioned to you, who was I think he was on the board of Global 2000, along with Jimmy Carter and Abedi. This guy's name was, Roichi. I want to say Roichi Sasakawa, but hold on.
Right.
Roichi Sasakawa. And if you just look at him, like, he is the biggest suslord. He was heavily involved in the World Anti-Communist League. He was like a fanatical Japanese fascist, was accused of war crimes, became incredibly wealthy after the war. And he said that Mussolini was, quote, the perfect fascist and dictator after meeting him.
Okay,
but yeah,
word.
so
Yeah.
somebody like that, like hanging out with Sigmund Rhee, Chiang Kai-shek, President Sukarno. He said once, quote, "I am the world's richest fascist." He supported the Unification Church and all kinds of other fun things like that. And so, God, Jimmy Carter, like, I know he likes talking to everybody, but like he did end up in some weird places in the 80s, hanging out there. But anyways, the idea that like this is just Abedi like manipulating everybody instead of, I mean, who came out on top at the end of all of this? Did Abedi come out on top?
No.
Like, come on.
He certainly did not. I mean, he says like a bunch of hilarious things. Like this is another thing I flagged. Says 1979 was a watershed year for Abedi. It was the year Zia finally hanged the troublesome Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, thereby clearing the way for Abedi's unimpeded access to the top of the Pakistani political establishment. The Middle East was about to ignite in war and revolution, and Abedi and his bank would become major, if hidden, players in a historical restructuring of power and alliances in the Islamic world. In January, America's greatest non-Jewish ally in the Middle East, the Shah, fled Iran. Leaving his country to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and his Revolutionary Council. Later that spring, the Camp David Accords, fostered by President Carter to bring peace to the Middle East and luster to his faltering administration, fell apart as Saudi Arabia had severed diplomatic ties with Egypt, joining the general Arab boycott of the Sadat regime. Crown Prince Fahd ibn Abdulaziz had decided that if the United States couldn't save the Shah, it couldn't save Saudi Arabia from the fundamentalists either. I don't know if that was his reasoning, but anyway. In the aftermath of Camp David, Crown Prince Fahd concluded an agreement with General Zia to finance 2 battalions of Pakistani commandos to be on permanent standby in the case of trouble in the Gulf. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein seized power. That was Abedi's agenda, obviously. And in November 4th,
another CIA asset.
Yeah, the Iranian revolutionaries stormed the American embassy at Tehran and seized 66 hostages, an event that would ultimately remove Jimmy Carter from the White House and usher in Ronald Reagan. And this, strengthened Abedi's position, and his profits were all enhanced. And by everything that he was doing, he was receiving oil from the revolutionary government, blah, blah. It was all part of his plan.
All part of his plan. He's the Muslim Soros.
He was the mastermind. Yeah, he's very convenient. I think that like one of the best examples of like the sort of the role of Abedi as like a very convenient figure in all of this is this one last anecdote that I definitely want to read during this episode from this book because it's truly amazing and introduces a very interesting character. You said that maybe the sort of Nazi element would not be maybe mentioned here, but I think perhaps it will be because there is this one sort of informant that Beatty has in this book who sticks out as being interesting. His name is, he goes by a pseudonym, he's unidentified, but he's a high German weapons dealer named Heinrich.
Okay.
He's described as a
weapons dealer.
Yes, a weapons dealer who apparently, works with BCCI. He reaches out to Beatty and meets with him. Yeah, here we go. So he's meeting with a bunch of different informants at this one time. This kind of connects also to the sort of controlled demo type, allegations here. This is kind of about that one, the plane being downed or, mysteriously crashing. That sort of, I don't know if they mentioned that in False Prophets at all, but it's a big.
Which plane?
The
one in Georgia?
Here. Not in Georgia. It was, let me see where actually did it crash. It's interesting. Yeah, there was apparently a group that called themselves like the Families for Truth about this plane crash. Yeah, Families for Truth about Gander Incorporated. It was a plane carrying 248 American soldiers returning from the Middle East in Gander, Newfoundland in December 1985. Doesn't give a specific date.
Oh, wow.
I
hadn't heard about this one before.
Yeah, it's interesting. So anyway, he meets with two people. One is called Gene Wheaton. They're both weapons dealers.
Okay.
One is called Gene Wheaton, and the other one is this guy Heinrich. I don't know if that's his real name. Heinrich definitely has a pseudonym. Gene Wheaton's off-the-wall contribution centered on the former military intelligence officer's investigations into the real cause of the crash of a plane carrying 248 American soldiers returning, from the Middle East and Gander, Newfoundland. Even though Islamic Jihad terrorists had quickly boasted they blew up the jet chartered from Arrow Air, a CIA-connected company, both the U.S. and Canadian governments insisted the plane had plunged to the ground because of ice on the wings. There was abundant evidence to the contrary. Wheaton, serving as a private investigator for the Families for the Truth About Gander, Incorporated, an organization formed by relatives of most of the soldiers who perished in the crash, believed that that Iranian terrorists blew up the plane out of anger after they received a shipment of defective Hawk missile parts from the United States. I don't know if that's the truth, but, maybe this plane was crashed. But anyway, that missile equipment was part of the then secret Arms for Hostages deal authorized by the White House and orchestrated by CIA Chief William Casey and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Wheaton thought the government refused to acknowledge the real reason for the disaster because it would have threatened the ongoing clandestine negotiations. The reporter took notes as Wheaton, the reporter being the actual writer of the book, again, it's all in the third person, sitting in the brown leather chair, described the federal investigation to the crash site. The scene was a mess, Wheaton explained. Even though the government later said there was no explosives aboard, firefighters heard small arms popping all over the place and saw debris flying into the air from delayed explosions. There were 6 heavy wooden crates aboard that probably contained contraband arms that had been loaded into the jet's cargo in Cairo without military customs clearance. Beatty was reminded of the heavy wooden crates aboard the CIA plane of Karachi as described by Sam Masri, and dropped his eyes to his notes so his sudden interest wouldn't show. The BCCI link was coming. The military got those crates out of there fast. Since they were never on the manifest, they were never referred to again, and neither was the money that was taken out. Bingo. What money? Wheaton didn't hesitate. Nobody except the people who removed it knows how much there was. But a 32-kilo Army-issued duffel bag stuffed with U.S. currency was found in the wreckage. How many $100 bills does it take to fill a 70-pound duffel? 2 men in civilian clothes, men that the military personnel on the site believed to be from the CIA, took custody of the money and departed immediately after that. Gene, how public is that information about the money? It figures to be millions. Has that ever been reported in the press? Beatty asked. Not to my knowledge, and I've read just about everything on the subject. Wheaton sounded a bit defensive, automatically assuming the reporter was questioning what he had said. But there is no dispute about the fact that it was found. There are references in the records, but you have to know where to look. There are transcripts. No problem. I was just wondering. Then Heinrich comes to the picture. Heinrich, who was close to high-level people in BCCI since they financed many of his sub-Rosa deals, had also recently mentioned the Newfoundland crash. Heinrich didn't sell surplus military rifles for a living. He did multi-million-dollar deals with the governments of second and third world countries looking for tanks, sophisticated fighter planes, and tactical missiles. And he worked with the top echelon of the BCCI apparatus, who specialized in weapons procurement and financing. He had been describing a particular conversation with some of his BCCI contacts. Beatty remembered every word of Heinrich's offhand comment. They were complaining about losing a lot of money in the Gander crash. It was BCCI money, and they thought it was being, perhaps, stolen from them. Beatty ended the session with Wheaton as soon as he could and called Heinrich at the hotel. The bespectacled German, neatly dressed, was sitting in the leather chair, the only decent chair in the room, really, looking bemused and a little worn. He looked, Beatty thought, like an accountant who had lived a very hard life. Ex-Nazi? No, a very hard life of being. Well, the reporter aborted a sharp. Heinrich reminded him of a testy university professor who expected students to remember every precious word he uttered. I don't have your kind of mind, Heinrich. You're pretty unusual, you know. There aren't many people who can retain as many details as you do. If I don't write it down, I forget it, especially when I don't understand what I'm being told. And a lot of what you told me when we first met was going over my head. Placated, the arms dealer relented slightly. He was not so smart that he couldn't be appealed to on the basis of his superior intellect. After years of interviewing everyone from captain's ministry to mafia hitman, Beatty was still amazed by how far a little flattery could take him, blah, 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 blah. You know, the plane had money that Abedi, money that the bank had provided U.S. intelligence for covert operations. The money was being used by the American military. I have no idea what for. You don't ask these kinds of questions of these people. That was not my business there. And I was just listening to them talk. But money of this sort is always cash, unlimited cash sometimes. And there is never any paperwork. So there's never real accountability. And that means that it does not always go for the uses that it was intended. Heinrich smiled one of those humorless smiles that made him look older. One of the bankmen, perhaps I should call him an associate of the bankmen, was a little angry about this money. He believed it was being appropriated by some of the special forces soldiers. Someone else thought perhaps it was being diverted to another operation. Who could tell? I only know that the subject of the Gander crash came up and these people talked about BCCI money going down with it. So, that's
somebody sabotaged a plane full of like military soldiers,
yes.
full of U.S. soldiers to crash it, kill everybody, and steal like tens of millions of dollars of like black money.
Yes. According to Heinrich, it was all the BCCI. They were the paymasters. He says, Jonathan, I have already told you. It's not that you don't remember. There's something wrong with your mind. You didn't believe me. Abedi was close to Bill Casey. They met many times. BCCI financed operations. BCCI brokered weapons and supplies. BCCI acted as a paymaster. You yourself told me that American operatives in Wiesbaden were using BCCI credit cards.
You want to know something?
What?
Okay. Well, first of all, remind me who Durrani is.
I'm not sure, actually. Did I just mention him?
Durrani, hold on. Let me go back just a little bit. I think I might have an educated guess as to who Heinrich is.
Oh, who is it?
Well, hold on. First of all, who the fuck is Durrani? God damn it. I hate it when books don't write the first name. Arif Durrani. Okay, so he was he got caught up in Iran-Contra, right? Arif Durrani was a Pakistani arms dealer who went to U.S. federal prison for illegally providing Hawk anti-aircraft missile parts to Iran. Yeah, so he used BCCI.
He would sell arms like in connection with them.
He did a lot of deals using BCCI to finance the export of weapons to Iran and was like evading the arms embargoes and things like that. But the interesting thing that I found in the Outlaw Bank is it just says here, Beatty's interest in Durrani was focused on BCCI. Sources had said Durrani was part of the BCCI group, that he knew Abedi personally, and that his operations were financed by the bank. Durrani was also close to Mustafa Gokal, the director of Abedi's mysterious shipping company. Beatty was also intrigued by one uncontested fact that had emerged at Durrani's trial. Here we go. Until his arrest, Durrani had been the managing director of Merex, a California arms firm that was a main supplier of the Israelis. Now, I'm pretty sure Merex came up before, and I'm going to be bringing it up soon in a Liberian context, but you can find an article about it on Wikispooks. It was basically, it was an arms dealing company founded in 1963 in Switzerland by a gentleman named Gerhard Mertens, and with assistance from one of his old World War II comrades, Otto Skorzeny. And
interesting.
Yeah, he was a Nazi commando in World War II. Gerhard Mertens.
Interesting.
And he served under Otto Skorzeny. He was one of the soldiers that did that daredevil hang gliding operation to rescue Benito Mussolini. I think he was a Hauptsturmführer. I forget his exact rank. And he was a guy who basically became an international CIA operative after World War II, working kind of with Otto Skorzeny and the kind of international Nazi underground. Now, he was a little old. He was still, Merex, I've read elsewhere, Merex was involved in certain transactions with Iran-Contra, and I would not be surprised in the slightest if they had overlap or financial interest with BCCI. Now, he was a little old, so I don't think that that maybe Gerhard is this. He would have been dead by the time this book came out. I think he died in 1993. But as it happens, he had a son named Helmut.
He died in 1998, and this probably happened before 1993.
Yes, but he still was very old, and he was getting out of the business, and he has a son named Helmut. Heinrich, Isn't it often, you choose a pseudonym, maybe you have the same first letter as your real name? And he actually, I remember a few years ago looking into him. He lives in Northern Virginia. He's a CIA and NSA contractor and a international businessman to this day. And he inherited some aspect of his father's international arms dealing business. And now he's just like a rich guy who lives in basically, I forget, Reston, Virginia, wherever the fuck. And also like, I think it was the book Shadow World by Andrew Feinstein that talked about how Helmut Mertens was like probably in his 30s in the 1980s, or he was like a young up and coming guy. And he also was dispatched to work out some Iran-Contra arms shipments in the 80s. So he was already working for his father's company and planning on taking over the business. And I think actually he had a brother too. I'm forgetting his name right now. But both the brothers, the Mertens brothers, like took over the business in the 90s, like around the time their father died. And I don't know. I mean, could be him, could be not, but it would be interesting. The only mark against it would be that seems like these guys are so good at hiding in the shadows. I don't know why he would talk to an author and be a confidential source. Well, that's what's so weird.
And he came out, as he writes, Heinrich had come out of the cold voluntarily and quite early in the game and was one of the decidedly non-establishment sources for a small piece in the cover story. It was weird, A
little weird and suspicious.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I mean, maybe some more of this, because that's only really the tip of the iceberg in terms of Heinrich content, really.
Okay.
Because he starts to seed a bunch of...
With this in mind, let's hear what else Heinrich has to say.
So, even Beatty, who is, not immune to being a bit sensationalist himself, writes, the BCCI empire that Heinrich described was too outrageously dramatic to be believed. It sounded like a movie about an international conspiracy. All the German would say was that Agha Hasan Abedi was an evil man, and the way things were going, the full story of BCCI was going to be buried. So, he says, there is no longer any doubt this mysterious man who liked to quote Teilhard de Chardin and Nietzsche was a major player in the Eastern European weapons market and enjoyed a close business relationship with the BCCI. He was the one who brought up the idea that, Abedi had been brokering technology to the Soviets. He says, the supercomputer deal ran through India about 15 months ago. It was E.S. Vijay Kumar who handled it. I don't remember whether this was the son or the father. It was the father who handled the deal. That's Mala Export Corporation, 31 Kothari Road, Madras, India. They have offices in London and Abu Dhabi, and they have a lot of high technology stuff with BCCI in Russia.
Interesting. Because remember in Contra 5, we talked about how a huge plank of Bill Casey's strategy to undermine the USSR was to stop third-party countries, like non-aligned countries, from transferring or selling certain types of technology. A lot of that really had to do with like Nord Stream 1, right?
Yeah.
Which is still kind of relevant to this day. Like they were fighting Nord Stream 1 the way we ended up kind of fighting Nord Stream 2. Like it was a kind of very similar mentality and but he got down to the point of like, certain turbine parts or like certain computer chips, like we need to make sure not only that we don't give it to them, but like they can't go anywhere on the global market and buy it. And that would definitely include places like Pakistan, India, these sort of non-aligned countries.
Right. He even said, it is important, Heinrich said, it is important this information be known. The American intelligence agents who have worked with BCCI will not talk to you because they believe it will be disloyal, even those who think it has gone too far. If they knew that Abedi was working with the Soviets, it would put things in a different light for them. They might talk to you then.
So was he trying to kind of gin up this idea that dun dun dun, like BCCI was helping the Soviets?
Speaking of gin up, Heinrich is the source of probably the most like wild and wacky. Before just to read everything of his testimony or his statements in this book that I want to read. He's the source of one of the most wild Abedi stories in this whole book. Yeah, at some point, Beatty is talking to Heinrich. It says, Beatty called him from Connecticut and told his computer had been found. He was exultant. He had been worried that if it wasn't found, Heinrich might bolt for a hole and never surface again. He wouldn't have blamed him. Beatty was in Hartford to talk with the imprisoned Arif Durrani, a Pakistani arms dealer convicted of selling to Iran parts for the US-designed Hawk missile system. BCCI was the banker. Beatty and an ABC News team were going to interview Durrani at 9 in the morning. Into the third round of six packs, the conversation took a sharp right turn into Catholic metaphysics. Gwynn was not a Catholic, but he had read the Revelation of St. John. He soon realized that the High German Catholic's weapons dealer and Terry Hayes, the Irish Catholic cop from Brooklyn, were talking seriously about the Antichrist, specifically about Agha Hasan Abedi as the Antichrist.
Whoa.
Heinrich, the pragmatic international weapons dealer, was convinced that Abedi's power and influence were manifestations of pure evil. You know, I have heard some strange things Abedi was supposed to be able to do, said Gwynn, struggling to keep up with the dialectic. The BCCI employees were quoted describing a sort of trick Abedi would do at training seminars. He would hold a piece of paper in his hand and tell them to concentrate on an ink spot in the middle of it, making it grow and shrink in size. As it turned out, there was no ink spot, but he made them believe it. Everyone considered this in its new context. They had all heard stories about Abedi's mesmerizing aura. Then Heinrich said, I'll tell you something. I've never told anyone this before. I saw him do something. I was in Lahore. He had some sort of office there. And the day I was visiting, he happened to be in. So my client suggested we meet him. Just a brief hello. When we walked up, the door to his office opened by itself. We went in and I turned, expecting to see whoever opened the door. But the only person in the room was Abedi, seated at his desk. When we left, the door closed silently by itself. I don't think it was anything mechanical. I've never seen anything like it.
What the fuck?
He and Hayes then began to discuss the nature of evil and God's purpose on Earth. The detective continued to go on alert every time room service showed up. Gwynn was thinking about the implications of Heinrich's story, but not about whether Abedi could or could not do some spooky things. This was the first time Heinrich had indicated that he knew or had even met Abedi. Both Beatty and John Moscow believed the German knew a great deal more about BCCI than he had revealed so far, and perhaps they were right. They had all been reserving judgment on a couple of things Heinrich had told them about high-level bribes BCCI had paid and his assertions about BCCI's involvement in narcotics trafficking. So, yeah, there you go. He was apparently...
Yikes.
Yeah.
He had nefarious... nefarious superpowers.
I mean, it's interesting because it kind of does overlap with sort of the, Sheikh role that he had, like in the institution itself, kind of like in the way that he conceived it as like a mystical institution in their, it's
and
like,
all of his like new agey kind of motivational kind of
so it does
dressing.
kind of. Yeah, it does kind of converge with how like he might have perceived himself in the institution as this kind of sheikh or guru figure. But it's interesting that Heinrich had a totally different take on it. So I don't know
that he was satanic.
Yeah, he was the Antichrist.
Wow.
Yeah, he seemed quite persuaded from this anyway. Yeah, I don't know, but
interesting. I think.
So
well,
who knows
okay.
what this guy is getting at.
I don't know. I just want to note here that Merex AG did once broker the sale of German Air Force fighter jets to Pakistan, which were delivered via Iran. And also, I remember I checked up on Helmut Martins. Like, not only is an arms trafficker, he runs something called United International Supplies in Alexandria, Virginia. That was started in 1987.
Wow.
Okay, so he started his own company. He broke off his own company in 87, and they were caught a few years ago. Actually, no, this company itself played a role in Iran-Contra. And they were also found to be thousands of weapons that were found in the possession of ISIS were basically from this company. So, I mean, I think Heinrich is Helmut Martins. I'm just throwing it out there. I think it's fucking true.
Yeah, it seems possible.
Yeah, is there any other insane Heinrich tales?
That's the creme de la creme there.
Okay.
The Antichrist door opening closing story.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Maybe we'll talk. I think, as our last little segment here, I think maybe we should talk about like the overall thesis of the from BCCI to ISI kind of thing. Or I don't know. I mean, we've kind of made references to it and stuff, but this book is actually a very interesting.
Yeah.
breakdown, like very like full-throated calling out of Operation 9/11 in a way that it's weird because the first part of the book is about BCCI. I kept reading it, expecting it to like literally tie these two kind of events together, but he's more just like holding them up as examples of kind of how the U.S. operate, like the U.S. deep state kind of operates. And like, see, like the ISI is going to get set up for a criminal conspiracy, just like the BCCI got set up, you know, in the late 80s. But I mean, you can't help but notice that a lot of the main players in both, like they're the same people basically involved that were connected to kind of Iran-Contra BCCI shit in the 80s, and then were involved in the lead up to what he calls Operation 9/11 in 2001, which he sees as a blatant, like a very complex manipulative entrapment scheme by like the U.S. intelligence services and kind of its allies to not only, I mean, utilize the ISI to help pull off the operation, but implicate themselves, even if probably like most of the people did not realize that was going to happen. And I think it makes a pretty good case for it. I mean, certainly on the realm of, I think something that does usually get blown over sometimes in the whole 9/11, like the 9/11 truth universe, is the this individual, General Mahmoud Ahmad, right? The chief of the ISI, like I think from like 1999 to, I guess, maybe very early 2000, maybe at the end of 2001, he was fired by Musharraf, you know, who is like, in terms of people that have incredibly sus connections to the attacks themselves, like literally a money trail leading up to it. It doesn't get more clear than General Ahmed, right?
Yeah.
Because he wired through an associate. He wired to Muhammad Atta $100,000 like before the 9/11 attacks. And so it's like,
apparently he's a hafiz of the Quran. He has the Quran memorized.
Really?
That's a point in his favor. Allegedly.
Allegedly. Yeah. But I mean, this goes pretty much into how, I mean, it's sort of unclear like how much he really knew, but some of the meetings that were had, and once again, we circle right around to like the Americans involved in like the first Americans, if you will, you know, Bob Graham and Porter Goss, who went to Pakistan, right, in I think the summer of 2001, and they met with I think Musharraf. But they definitely met with Mahmoud Ahmad and discussed. It was classified. It wasn't public, so we have no idea what they discussed. And then Mahmoud Ahmad went on like a week-long visit to Washington D.C., which I feel like that feels like a little bit abnormal for like a foreign intelligence chief of a sort of ally to like come and hang out in Washington for like a week or two. But he was having a series of meetings. He had a series of pre-9/11 top-level meetings in the White House, the Pentagon, the National Security Council, and with CIA Director George Tenet and Mark Grossman, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Like, what was he meeting about? Like, what was so important before fucking 9/11 that you would? And then the morning of 9/11, he was having a breakfast meeting, like literally as the attacks were commencing. He was having a breakfast meeting with the chairman of the House and the Senate Intelligence Committees, Senator Bob Graham and Representative Porter Goss, who were both basically represented Florida. And Porter Goss, as I think, I was happy to see him cite Daniel Hopsicker a bunch of times, like in this part of the book, because he actually ended up digging up like an old photo, which is, I think, the first time anybody confirmed it, of Porter Goss, I think, in Mexico City in the early 60s, hanging out with, like, David Atlee Phillips and Barry Seal, among others. Like, all the guys that allegedly maybe were involved. They were definitely involved in Castro assassination campaigns in the early 60s, but might have had something to do with the JFK assassination. So, like, Porter Goss is, like, goes back like deep, and he's also like a blue blood. His family are like the brass kingpins of Waterbury, Connecticut, which I know because my dad was born there. And they're straight up have been sending their boys to Yale since like before the revolution type of people, right? So he's one of these scary like intelligence fire wasps, basically, that has served in the CIA clandestinely and then got into politics. And eventually after 9/11 in 2004, George W. Bush made him the CIA director for like 2 years. Again, it feels like maybe a cleanup operation. But anyway, it's like you couldn't think of two susser individuals. And they're also chairing the fucking House and Senate intelligence committees. Like, and then, of course, you remember the congressional inquiry into 9/11. Who chaired that afterwards, right? The same guys sitting down for breakfast with Mahmoud Ahmad on the morning of 9/11. The same guy who wired Muhammad Atta $100,000 and like had to resign because of it. Like that's not contested. Like he did it and got caught and was like, oh shit, like, you know, and nothing really happened to him. You know, so I don't know, was he fully in on it or was he about to get set up? It's just so, I don't know. What do you think about like those meetings?
It's one thing that I think is interesting that BCCI, or I appreciate about BCCI to ISI, which I think a lot of like 9/11 truth content. I do like the perspective of this book because, you know, it is like it's like a third world perspective. You know, it's like I appreciate it going to bat for Abedi in some respects. And I think it's interesting that, you know, the emphasis on the fact that bin Laden was framed. Is like another interesting aspect of this. And, you know, it is interesting that like, you know, we don't really know, I'm skeptical of like the reports about what was found in bin Laden.
I was just thinking about that.
Like,
his
but it is interesting that he
list.
had like a collection of like 9/11 truth books.
He had Michael Rupert's Crossing the Rubicon.
Yeah.
He also had the entire church committee report on MK Ultra. I remember looking at it the other day. Like he had all like the conspiracy
weird that they would
bangers.
like fabricate that. Like, you know, I think that there's a lot of like bullshit around the bin Laden, you know, killing.
For sure.
But it is kind of like a weird conspicuous thing. I don't know.
Remember that? I mean, wasn't the whole outside like story of that is that like Pakistan was protecting him?
Yeah, they were protecting him.
But we never did anything about it, interestingly.
Yeah, I remember Jon Stewart being like, "What? Pakistan?" Like complaining. Our future president, Jon Stewart, the Zelensky Democrat who will save us all.
Yeah. I remember Obama, like, interestingly, during the primary, he sort of staked out his ground of like, well, you know, if we find a terrorist in Pakistan and they don't give us approval, I'd call in the strike, you know? And people were kind of like, whoa, Obama, like kind of hawkish. But, you know, he was about smart power, you know, a scalpel, not a hammer. He was planning
the turnaround. He was planning the ISI entrapment.
Exactly.
That we all know is eventually coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we have seen like the sort of ground being laid in the PSYOP terrain, because wasn't that like the plot of Homeland, like, you know, for a couple seasons that like the ISI, we need to go after them. Like
I think it was in the drone season when she was the drone queen, because she was fighting the Haqqani network, and they had like weird ISI ties and stuff. But once again, it's kind of like, you know, I think the good point this book makes is like also the ISI was kind of built up by the CIA, like from the start. Like it was one of those kind of like the DFS in Mexico. It was one of these intelligence agencies that was like they brought in like CIA and US military advisors to basically build this thing from the ground up, and they always had like a very tight relationship with them. So the idea that like ISI is just like totally running rogue, like running off, doing their own thing, or like they're gonna turn on us one day. Apparently, also like I don't know, General Hamid Gul, who I think wasn't he the previous ISI chief before, or did he become president at one point? Hamid Gul.
He was. Yeah, it was. I think it was Mahmoud Ahmad who was the.
Yeah, Mahmoud Ahmad. I forget what General Hamid Gul, exactly his role, but he did say on September 14th, 2001, quote, Bush Sr. was vice president during that entire campaign, and no sooner did he become president on January 20th, 1989, than he summoned an interagency intelligence meeting and issued an order, among several others, to clip the wings of the ISI that had been coordinating the entire operation in Afghanistan. I knew this firsthand as I was DG ISI at the time. He was the director.
Right. Yeah. He was DG ISI during the Afghanistan and Soviet War. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I forgot. President Zia's plane was blown out of the sky. What's the official story with President Zia?
In terms of his plane being blown out of the sky?
Yeah. Did they say it was a crash? Or is it like, oh, he got shot by a missile?
I think it was like just like a mysterious crash. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's like one of those things. It's just like, oops, the plane.
Well, Wikipedia says there's several conspiracy
yeah, it's weird
theories.
how these themes keep coming up, like strange plane crashes, like seems to be like a go-to tactic for some people. I don't know.
Yeah. You know what? The other thing that was really fascinating that I wasn't really aware of that this book lays out is the Daniel Pearl murder. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
That was a big deal after 9/11. This Wall Street Journal journalist gets kidnapped in Pakistan, and then he gets beheaded, right, on video.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And eventually they arrest somebody for it. They arrest Saeed Sheikh, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, Saeed Sheikh apparently was the go-between who actually, like Mahmoud Ahmad ordered Saeed Sheikh to transfer the $100,000 like in his name, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So this guy was like part of the financing network of the so-called attackers. But then he wasn't like prosecuted for that. Instead, a year later, he gets prosecuted for kidnapping Daniel Pearl. And the author here asserts that he actually didn't do the Daniel Pearl murder. He thinks that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed did it.
Yes,
and he thinks the reason
but he couldn't be
killed,
sacrificed quite yet. Yeah.
No.
Right.
So he was convicted as the mastermind, and I assume he was executed.
In fact, like the Pakistani police and the FBI rounded up 10 of Saeed Sheikh's relatives and threatened to harm them unless he turned himself in.
Yeah, exactly.
In response to
so
intense
shady.
pressure from the U.S. government.
Yeah, so it's like that maybe they were worried that if he was arrested and put on trial, that he might actually start talking about like some of these networks that were involved in the prep to 9/11. Now, interestingly,
this whole part honestly is worth reading. The ISI held Saeed for a week, but failed to tell Pakistani police or anyone else that they had him. This missing week is the cause of much speculation. The ISI never told Pakistani police any details about this week. Saeed later refused to discuss this week or his connection to the ISI. His refusal to talk was tantamount to admitting that he had been threatened by the ISI. He kept saying, "I will not discuss this subject. I do not want my family to be killed. I know people in the government and they know me and my work."
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, he mentions, the group that kidnapped Daniel Pearl and like made demands. I had forgotten about this, but they're really something. I just have to. So Daniel Pearl was kidnapped while investigating the ISI's connection to different militant groups. And apparently the bizarre demands from Daniel Pearl's kidnappers deepened the suspicion people had that maybe Pearl was getting dangerously close to discovering who planned 9/11. The kidnappers called themselves the National Movement for the Restoration of Pakistani Sovereignty, a previously unheard of group. Their demands included the return of U.S.-held Pakistani prisoners and the departure of U.S. journalists from Pakistan. Most unusual, they demanded that the United States sell F-16 fighter planes to Pakistan. No group had ever shown interest in the F-16s. What the fuck? The Guardian reported that this demand and the others reflected the desires of Pakistan's military and the ISI to obtain the fighter planes. On January 29, 2002, it was reported the U.S. intelligence believed the kidnappers to have been connected to the ISI. Some captured kidnappers later claimed that the ISI asset, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was the man who cut Pearl's throat. So, what the fuck? You must give us 30 F-16s right now.
Yeah.
We're revolutionaries. Okay. Yeah. Just absolute, almost clown level shit. But unfortunately for Daniel Pearl, RIP to a real one, I guess he actually was I guess he was being a conspiracy theorist and actually trying to figure out some of these connections. But they had to kill him.
Yeah, he passed the anti-Semitic point of no return, and he had to go down.
He did. And remember that. I mean, that all that did was make Americans more bloodthirsty to invade Iraq, even though it was totally different and had nothing to do with anything. Just the idea of they're cutting off our heads. What the fuck? These sick Muslim maniacs. They're really. And in the meantime, it's no, we're murdering journalists who are getting too close to discovering like the real interlocked networks. The other thing I think that the two other things that are mentioned, and maybe we can come back to these one day. I'm going to come back in Demon Forces on the 1998 embassy bombings that Al-Qaeda allegedly did, that he notes in the book. Basically, the FBI's the FBI's investigation was like completely frustrated when they went over there to Africa, and like their supervisors, like in the State Department or whatever, told them like, "Stop! You're not going to prosecute anybody. Like, shut the fuck up." And on top of that, the people accused of it like probably didn't even do it, and like Osama bin Laden probably didn't even order that attack, and it was all a big psyop. But the other one was like Charlie Wilson's War and all that jazz, which is very funny. It would be kind of funny to circle back to that,
Charlie
that
Wilson
psyop
gets
of
it
a
really
movie.
hard. Yeah, in this book. Yeah, that would be interesting. I remember seeing that in theaters.
He became so close with Israel. Yeah, that movie, the Aaron Sorkin movie, is like, really probably something to witness. Oh yeah, that's where they mentioned that William Casey's executive assistant Robert Gates was, I don't know, involved, and also that I think like Charlie Wilson went on like a junket trip to Israel, and he came back and people called him like the Israeli commando in Congress because he was just like so gung ho.
Well, in his own words, he was like, "I'm the Israeli commando," and he said like he went to Lebanon and he said the biggest surprise I had was the enthusiasm, the universal enthusiasm with which the Lebanese welcomed the Israeli army.
Yes.
In every instance, their voices were of relief and appreciation of the Israelis. That's just the way it is. It ain't no other way. All right.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, the person who played a key role in having Wilson appointed to the White House Select Committee on Intelligence was none other than Dick Cheney. They actually lay out a kind of interesting dynamic of kind of how like Israel exercised influence in those decades, and probably still does, in terms of like the reason that they started going after kind of bribing and like seducing politicians is because the CIA kind of like even though there's obviously close cooperation, there's kind of like a little bit more of a distrust, a mutual distrust between the CIA and Mossad. So they can't necessarily, it's like if they go to see, it's like CIA kind of like knows their tricks, like as a fellow intelligence agency. Whereas if they kind of go around it and win over a bunch of Congress people who are pretty easy to buy off, then they can sort of exercise their like a certain level of veto power over things they don't like. And then I guess also you could sort of look at what like the Gulf countries did with politicians from like the Carter administration and people in the 80s as kind of copying the Israeli strategy of like, oh, if we win over all of these like elected officials and butter them up and get them kind of on our side, then we can kind of get our influence in there as well. I think that's kind of what, to some extent, that's what Abedi was maybe trying to do, because a lot of them did look at it as like Israel has huge clout in like the U.S. government, and like Arabs have very little clout, but like we have enough leverage, you know, mainly through oil, that we could get a piece of that action as well. But at the end of the day, like who's really playing the tune everyone's marching to? Is it the Arabs? Is it Israel?
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
no, not at all. Yeah.
I think there's a dialectical kind of power relationship going on with some of these things, but at the same time, like who ends up going down in flames?
It's not like totally teleological where, you know, the U.S. has like complete control of everything and it's hopeless to resist them in any way, or people don't have like their own agency and there's only like one factor in anything that happens. But, you know, I think it's just the narrative around the BCCI is highly convenient and a lot of the time. And it overlooks like a huge benefit, which is, you know, like we talked about, it's like since time immemorial, the efforts to undermine the economic independence of the Muslim world, really, and to make sure that, you know, like everything is like you know, for the open market or whatever, you know, like that everything's, you know, free to be, you know, developed, and, you know, that you can't have anything that's, you know, no waqfs, that's regressive, you know, that's not progress. That's not progress, you know, it's holding you back. But then once you try to play by their game, you have to be destroyed.
I mean, how does he say it? Like, if you sup with the devil, you best be eating with a long spoon or something.
What?
That's what the...
Oh yeah, if you sup with the devil, use a long spoon. This proverb was current in the 14th century.
Yes.
Yeah,
so I think
Chaucer uses those
Abedi
Canterbury Tales,
didn't
yeah.
use a long enough spoon, perhaps, with some of the people that he got
he did
involved
not,
with,
yeah.
and he really thought that he was one of them. But then he ended up getting just like so many people, like I don't know, like Barry Seal, like Manuel Noriega, so many, quote unquote dictator, or Pablo Escobar for that matter. People, they will X you out. Or maybe Zelensky. They will leave you out to dry. They'll leave you for dead, if not just kill you with a heart attack gun. Like when they're sort of done with you, because that diverts suspicion away from them. We never ended up thinking about these like respectable bankers, dealing in fraud, money laundering, drugs, death, prostitution, all these things. There's this like fake line between the legit moral economy powered by the all positive Protestant work ethic and what scary Muslims do with their Sharia banks or
their
something.
Evil Sharia banks. Yeah.
Yeah, they're evil Sharia banks.
Before we close out, I just want to mention that relative to the crash of Zia Hawk's plane, actually, the U.S. Air Force sent a helpful team of investigators to help them find out what happened. And they concluded that it was just wear and tear, and the plane just crashed. But the Pakistani investigators concluded that there probably was sabotage. So two different conclusions. But yeah.
It's like when Stephen Tolbert's plane crashed after he told Firestone that we got to renegotiate your deal, and they sent some helpful Americans there that privately nobody believed, and they were like, oh yeah, it just happens. Planes full of people that piss off the U.S. empire fall out of the sky sometimes. What's the big deal? But yeah,
all right,
we're truly in the endless maze of French arcs interlocking into oblivion today. But we dug up more of the Contra menace. I think we will be back in not too long with another one.
Yeah, for sure.
It will be interlocked as always. But until next time, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.
Scandal. In California, in our Burbank studio is Jonathan Beatty, senior correspondent of Time magazine. And with me here in New York is Peter Truel of the Wall Street Journal. Good morning, gentlemen. Let's dig into this. Jonathan, let's start with you. You covered the Watergate scandal. You had to investigate that for Time. How do you rank this with Watergate?
I think that this is is going to be seen as a bigger cover-up than Watergate ever was.
Why do you think that?
Well, something to put it personally, I have never seen a cover-up of the scope of this. It is just absolutely all-embracing. It's like trying to deal with reality covered up with blankets. Nothing is as it appears, and unfortunately, nothing much that the government says, our government says, is as it appears.
All right, wonderful imagery here, being covered up like a blanket. Let's get specific. Who is covering up? Or who's dragging the feet?
I think that if you want to use the word the establishment, this administration, the previous administration, is going to be damaged severely if the full degree of their hypocrisy in dealing with this bank and the duplicity of some of our government agencies comes to light.
Peter, let's jump in here, because you're in Washington, too. You investigate this. Do you agree?
Yes, I think, Gareth, you've got to remember that here we have BCCI for years controlling the biggest bank holding company in Washington, First American. And, of course, this is a bank that lends money to politicians, to lobbyists, to lawyers, to the most powerful people in the country. There is a tremendous unwillingness to open up a lot of what has gone on in Washington.
Now, what struck me and perhaps struck many of our viewers this morning is that we've heard from Senator Kerry, who's conducting an investigation with the subcommittee, and yet there's no real outcry coming from Congress, certainly not from the administration. And beyond that, there's no real outcry coming from either Democrats or Republicans per se. There is this eerie silence.
Well, Gareth, I think the reason for that is it's a scandal which has negatives for both Republicans and Democrats. Whether it's the administration, which seems to have dragged its feet, the Republicans. You have, as you were mentioning earlier, an aide to John Sununu who's gone off to, all of a sudden, who went off to work for one of the the main characters in the scandal. Then you also have the Democrats, whether it's in Georgia or also during the presidency of Jimmy Carter and so on.
Jonathan, again, any investigator, you and Peter both experienced, the journalists and investigators in this, you're looking for key figures. We've heard some today, Abedi, of course, and Adam, the former head of Saudi intelligence. Whom do you really keep your eye on? Who is the key figure from the BCCI side?
I think, as you mentioned earlier, if Sunny Ahmed, the Washington representative for the bank, is induced to talk, the house of cards in the United States is going to begin to crumble, and in several other countries. BCCI employees from the infamous Black Network, the group of the bank that did the drug dealing, the arms dealing, the surreptitious activities of the bank, they had told us about millions of dollars being sent to Sunny Ahmed in Washington to be distributed to this country. They have bragged that they have had more than 100 officials in the United States on their payroll at one time or another.
Now, you talk about this black network. Let's follow up on this point. It's been argued that in a way, the drug money launderers, other people with illicit funds and money transactions, the arms merchants, they need a bank like BCCI. There is a market demand for it. Is that what you found?
Well, not only do the drug dealers need a bank like this, the people moving capital flight, the people avoiding taxation, the people hiding corruption or bribery money, and intelligence agencies from both the eastern and western worlds needed this bank. I suppose if it wouldn't have been BCCI, it would have been somebody else.
And Peter, you want to jump in here on this?
It was a bank through which you could carry out any kind of transaction you wanted to, and you could do it out of sight. It would not be regulated. It would not be properly overseen.
We were talking about some of the BCCI officials who are key players, and when they talk, the whole house of cards collapses. It's a sensitive area here, but whom should we keep our eyes on in terms of possible American players? Again, indictments have not been handed down, but here's the focus of the investigation going.
Well, I think in Washington, the focus is moving more and more toward Washington, and also the question marks obviously are over the BCCI allies in Washington, their lawyers and lobbyists, Mr. Clifford, Mr. Altman, but also a string of other people from the Washington legal establishment.
Oh, let me tell you, talk about the establishment here. You're there, as is Jonathan, you go and you talk to somebody, you bring them up on the phone, you say, let's talk about BCCI. What kind of a response do you, Peter, get?
Now?
Yes.
Everyone is trying to distance themselves from BCCI, from the Tainter scandal.
So what do they tell you? I won't talk with you, they hang up the phone, they try to mislead you?
In many cases, people who were willing to talk last year or the year before are now not talking. I mean, in some cases, that's for fear of indictment or because their lawyers are advising them not to.
A moment ago, I know an answer from both of you in this. We heard an Assistant Attorney General, Robert Mueller, saying that they're pushing ahead of their investigation. We've heard other signs and seen other signs that they were dragging their feet. How do you come down on the Justice Department?
Well, I think things are moving along much faster now than they were before, and I think that there are big questions about why nothing was done earlier to look into BCCI's illegal ownership of banks in this country.
Jonathan, do you agree with that assessment of the Justice Department investigation?
Well, at the top, the Justice Department continues to insist that it's doing a vigorous investigation. I suppose I don't see it as being that vigorous. There are whole areas in which the Justice Department has not even begun talking to anybody yet. I think it's quite clear that there are questions that they would be uncomfortable with the answers and not pursuing.
All right, Jonathan, Peter, stand by and come back with more as we continue our special edition on BCCI. We'll be right back. Time Magazine investigative reporter in Los Angeles, and here with me is Peter Truel of the Wall Street Journal. We're talking about the sensitive aspects of Peter. Reading reports about business dealings with some of Bush's children, Bush Friends fundraiser.
That's correct. There are several dealings related to the bank which come home to the Bush family. The one which has drawn quite a lot of attention is an oil concession that was awarded in Bahrain, the island in the Persian Gulf, to a company, Harkin Energy, which George W. Bush, the president's eldest son, was a director and shareholder in. And many big oil companies were very envious of the awarding of this concession and were rather surprised that such a small oil company would get a contract when they had no overseas drilling experience and no offshore drilling experience.
But the contact was there, obviously, and they got the award.
Yeah.
And there's also Charles Hostler, ambassador to Bahrain. What's the story there?
Charles Hostler was a big donor to the Bush campaign in 1988. He also has other links. He has links to BCCI of the following nature. He's a friend and business associate, to some degree, of Mohammed Hammoud, a mysterious Lebanese businessman who died all of a sudden in April 1990, who bought Mr. Clifford and Mr. Altman's shares in First American's holding company at the highest price ever paid.
Well, lots of questions here, and Jonathan Beatty in Los Angeles, you add all of this up, and where do you think it's going to come out?
Well, our magazine once quoted a high Justice Department official, without giving his name for obvious reasons, who said, in the end, they're simply going to slap the wrist of a bunch of Pakistanis, get them to take the rap for everybody, and hope it all goes away before any real damage is done. Well, that's one assessment.